Often it is useful to look at the Primarchs and the legions in pairs. The one reflects deeper truths about the other than could be seen alone. Which pairing would be the most useful thematically is not always immediately apparent, but we can always make a guess. With Perturabo, the most obvious choice is Rogal Dorn. Their similarities serve to bring their differences into sharper focus. Thus, we shall next examine Rogal Dorn, Imperial Praetorian, whose stubbornness hides great grief and shame, whose greatest defensive battle and greatest offensive action were both Pyrrhic victories. Dorn's story offers a rich vein for exploration, from his deeply ingrained sense of duty and his attachment to the Emperor's ideals, to the burden he carries for his duty. Let's take a look at his early life, his discovery by the Emperor, and how his homeworld of Inwit shaped his character. In older canon, like the White Dwarf Codex Astartes articles, Dorn's homeworld had not been decided on. He just sort of appeared one day with the Phalanx. That's an interesting choice, and it means that his canon homeworld now is not so important to his character as with other Primarchs. Regardless, we're going to compare and contrast the worlds and cultures of Inwit, Fenris, which has similarly harsh winters and fearsome wildlife, Medusa, which similarly has a tradition of nomadic tribes fighting together against merciless weather, and Colchis, which similarly had a history of high technology, which had been lost for a time. Inwit is a freezing ice world, with a culture that prizes endurance, discipline, and loyalty. The harsh environment fosters a collectivist survival mentality. The nomadic tribes of Inwit unite around strong leaders to endure harsh winters. They value stoicism, hierarchy, and the ability to endure adversity. Rogal Dorn's personality thus mirrors some of Inwit's traits: methodical, unyielding, loyal to a fault. The world's ethos of communal survival was why the Emperor chose him as Praetorian, emphasizing fortitude and order. Fenris, an ice world with savage winters and great geologic upheaval. It's defined by its violent geography as well as its predatory wildlife. The world is ever-changing, with shifting tectonic plates creating a volatile environment, which make practices such as agriculture not reasonable options for most of the tribes. Fenrisian tribes are warrior-centric, glorifying individual valor and feats of arms. Survival hinges on martial prowess and adaptability. Like Inwit, Fenris forged a survival-focused culture, but Fenris emphasized martial valor in intertribal striving over collective discipline. So while Dorn embodies stoic resilience, Leman Russ reflects Fenris's feral, individualistic heroism. Dorn's sense of order and structure clashes with Russ's chaotic and impulsive tendencies. That's small lowercase c. Inwit's cold discipline is a foil to Fenris's savage energy. Medusa is kind of like a hot Fenris in some ways. It's a harsh world of storms and volcanic upheavals, demanding adaptability and engineering ingenuity in order to survive. Nomadic clans travel in mobile fortress ships, forging strong mechanical and survival skills. The people are pragmatic, and they value function over aesthetics. So, like on Inwit, Medusa shaped a collectivist, survival-oriented society, emphasizing resourcefulness and the communal good. Both worlds fostered resilience in their inhabitants. Medusa's culture of pragmatism and mechanical innovation thus influenced Pharasmanis' fixation on perfection and utility, whereas, by contrast, Inwit's disciplined hierarchy shaped Dorn's adherence to duty and his structuralist mindset, I'll call it. Now, Colchis is an interesting choice. It was once a high-tech world, but then Colchis descended into a feudal, religiously fervent state after the Age of Strife. We'll talk about Lorgar much later. He's very complicated. Theocratic and mystic, Colchis was dominated by zealotry and spiritual fervor. Its people lived in a rigidly hierarchical society centered on a state religion. So, like Inuit, Colchis's hierarchies reflect an emphasis on order and loyalty to authority. Both worlds valued strong leaders to unify disparate peoples behind a common ideal. But while Inuit's discipline was grounded in practical survival, Colchis's hierarchy was spiritual and dogmatic. Thus, Dorn's pragmatic stoicism contrasts with Lorgar's spiritual fervor and emotional sensitivity. Thus, each of these four worlds made Primarchs who valued survival but approached it in different ways. Inuit and Medusa emphasized collectivism, Colchis unity, and Fenris on individual strength and valor. Dorn's rigid discipline and fortification expertise reflect Inuit's need for communal resilience, whereas Fenris bred Russ's wild, instinctual leadership. The people of Medusa's focus on engineering helped to shape Pharasmanis' interest in mechanical means, whereas Colchis's religious culture worked very well alongside Lorgar's instinctive need for faith. We can see quite a bit of contrast here. Dorn's stoicism contrasts sharply with Russ's individualism and instinctive leadership, perhaps aligning more closely with Pharasmanis' pragmatism. And Lorgar just sticks out on his own, not similar to many other Primarchs. By taking a look at these worlds and the cultural imprints they left on their Primarchs, we can thus gain deeper insight into how environmental and societal factors shape their strengths, flaws, and ultimate fates. Now, that's if he's from Inuit, though. As previously mentioned, in older canon, Dorn met the Emperor by traveling to the Imperium on the Phalanx. In newer canon, the Emperor discovered Dorn by traveling to Inuit. What are the thematic differences there? Does changing canon so that he's from a homeworld and discovered by the Emperor work against his personality instead of reinforcing it? In older canon, where Dorn traveled to Terra on the Phalanx on his own initiative, there's themes of self-motivation, self-initiative, also called self-activation, and an early understanding of duty. This aligns with his character as a Primarch who constantly sought to prove his worth through action. The journey itself reflects an unshakable resolve, qualities central to Dorn's identity. A quality central to Dorn's identity. And then there's the symbolism of the Phalanx itself. Dorn bringing the Phalanx to Terra suggests that he actively offers his greatest tool to the Imperium. This act reinforces his identity as a builder and defender, as the Phalanx is the greatest warship that the Imperium has ever seen. It also reflects his sense of purpose and loyalty. He does not wait to be found, rather he seeks out the Emperor to serve. Thus, this narrative strongly ties Dorn to his eventual role as the Emperor's Praetorian, the stalwart guardian of the Imperium's heart worlds. It foreshadows Dorn's belief in meritocracy. He arrives ready to serve and to prove himself without waiting for external validation. In newer canon, meanwhile, we have the Emperor traveling to Inuit and finding him there, like most of the other Primarchs. This is a theme of selection and destiny, framing Dorn as the chosen one, rather than one who offers himself. This casts his discovery as a fulfillment of destiny, yes, but not an act of his own agency. It shifts a great deal of the emphasis away from Dorn's autonomy and places it on the Emperor's grand design. I feel that this was a mistake. This newer version highlights the world of Inuit and its cultural emphasis on Dorn. Yes, that's true. It emphasizes his origins and grounds him more firmly in his icy, disciplined upbringing. But we could have had that and still have him leave his home world to go to Terra. The new canon underscores the environmental and societal factors that shape Dorn, adding depth to his character's formation, but they do so by sacrificing the sense of self-activation and his own initiative. Ultimately, this is a weakening of his characterization. By having the Emperor come to Dorn, the story diminishes Dorn's proactive agency. It makes him more of a recipient of fate rather than an active participant in his destiny. This works against his stubborn, disciplined personality, which is heavily tied to self-determination and the need to prove himself. Dorn wants to prove himself through action, not through who he is. By having the story become about the Emperor having him as his son, that takes away from Dorn did a thing and that's why he's important. That is to say, in older canon, his actions reinforced his personality, aligning with his later struggles to earn recognition and validation from the Emperor. Newer canon shifts focus to his destiny and cultural background, thus enriching the context of Inuit but weakening Dorn's sense of agency. This is a mistake. There are several other Primarchs who would have been improved by having them seek out the Imperium instead of being found. But all their stories had already been written back in, the late 80s? This change in canon works against Dorn's personality. Now, it has good points. It adds depth to his home world and its environmental and cultural factors which shaped him. But it did so in a way that risks diminishing his proactive and resolute characterization. Dorn's greatest strengths, his pride in his work, his willingness to serve, his relentless sense of duty, are better supported by older canon where he chose to present himself and the Phalanx to the Emperor. The older narrative ties more effectively into Dorn's later struggles with validation and self-worth, themes which are central to his eventual death and his tragic stubbornness. By contrast, the newer version leans more heavily on external factors, which is at odds with the Primarch who became the Imperium's greatest builder and defender. In either case, Dorn had very little period of acclimation. Did he have any mentorship relationship with other Primarchs? Did he spend a great deal of time with the Emperor during the Great Crusade? Dorn's rapid integration into the Imperium reflects his practicality and his readiness to serve, but it also left limited time for deep mentorship or relationship building with the Emperor or with other Primarchs. Dorn's relationships with his brothers were generally characterized more by professional respect, or, in the case of Praetorian, by rivalry, rather than mentorship or emotional closeness. From what I have been able to find in canon, he was not specifically mentored by a different Primarch. Dorn's most famous relationship, of course, was with Praetorian, which was marked by competition, words are hard, some amount of mutual resentment. They represented two complementary aspects of the Emperor's vision: defensive fortifications and offense against enemy fortifications. But their inabilities to reconcile their differences or work together symbolize their shared stubbornness and pride. This rivalry deprived Dorn of a peer who could have challenged him constructively, and shared perspective and criticism, which would have enriched his own perspective and forced him to work harder, to be better. Now, he does have professional respect with some of the other Primarchs. What I've been able to find in canon is specifically Sanguinius and Guilliman. He held Sanguinius in high regard, recognizing his nobility and charisma, which he himself lacked, but there's not much evidence in canon of significant collaboration. Similarly, Dorn and Guilliman shared a great deal of respect for order and strategy, but their roles kept them largely separated, as did their positions within the galaxy. They were just cartographically, physically separated a long distance. Guilliman's leadership of the Ultramarines allowed him a degree of independence. He was more or less fighting a miniature Great Crusade on his own, whereas Dorn's position as Praetorian tied him closely to the Emperor, right in the main theaters of conflict. Dorn's early isolation from the other Primarchs thus deprived him of the opportunity to build deeper bonds with other brothers, whose differences from him might have tempered Dorn's rigidity and perfectionism. I feel that Jagatai Khan would have been a good choice, but whatever. Now, Dorn's position as the Emperor's Praetorian put him in close proximity to the Emperor during the Great Crusade. He spent more time with the Emperor than just about anybody else, possibly including Horus. But there were several factors which limited the depth of their relationship. Dorn's duties as the Imperium's master of fortifications and protector of Terra often meant that he was engrossed in the technical and logistical aspects of the crusade, when he was not specifically leading his legion in some great battle. His role allowed him little time for personal interaction or philosophical discourse or talking about feelings with the Emperor, and he seems to have made no effort to pursue any of those things, which he probably didn't care much about, as far as I can tell from his personality. And this is only on his side. On the Emperor's side, the Emperor was distant. He tended to keep his sons at arm's length emotionally. So Dorn was unlikely to receive a great deal of validation or guidance from him. Dorn's perfectionism and need for approval may have thus deepened the emotional gap between them, as Dorn sought recognition through deeds rather than through dialogue with the Emperor. And then there's the symbolism of Terra. Dorn's appointment as Praetorian anchored him to Terra, leading the legion who was responsible for the defense of the throne world. This is a symbolic and important but isolating position. Unlike more independent Primarchs who had the freedom to lead large-scale campaigns across the galaxy, Dorn's proximity to the Emperor was more of a professional obligation. He didn't have much in the way of choosing what to do there. He was just there because that was his duty. Dorn's character was a blend of rigid discipline, unrelenting duty, and, I believe, a quiet yearning for approval, all of which put him in a position of not being willing to reach out to other Primarchs or reach out to the Emperor to pursue emotional connection. His role as Praetorian put him in a position of great honor, but also one of isolation, leaving him with little support when faced by the immense pressures of the Horus heresy later. Now, in current canon, what might we learn about Dorn's character from his first meeting with the Emperor? Maybe it would be interesting for us to compare this meeting with that of other Primarchs from advanced worlds such as Macragge, or perhaps to contrast this meeting with those of Primarchs with a more combative upbringing, like Barbarous or Nuceria. Dorn's first interaction with the Emperor emphasized his immediate readiness to serve and his understanding of his role in the Imperium. In old canon, his presentation of the phalanx as a gift to the emperor symbolized his self-activation. In new canon, his presentation of the phalanx as a gift to the emperor symbolizes his practicality and selflessness, traits which define his character through the Great Crusade and into the Horus Heresy. Dorn's acceptance of the emperor as his leader was straightforward and devoid of internal conflict. It was similar to, for example, Sanguinius, recognizing the emperor as father right away. This loyalty was admirable, but it later contributed to his rigid thinking, making him less adaptable when faced with situations which challenged his worldview, or when faced with new challenges from outside pressures. Dorn's almost ascetic upbringing on Inuit and his immediate immersion in the emperor's vision suggest a leader who was used to bearing burdens alone, a trait which later isolated him emotionally and strategically. Guilliman, similar to Dorn, grew up on an advanced world with structured leadership, a strong sense of duty, and some substantial remnant of technology which had persisted through the Age of Strife. Both of them embraced the Emperor's vision with little resistance and immediately contributed their organizational and leadership skills to the Imperium. But there were differences between them. Guilliman's upbringing fostered skills in diplomacy and adaptability, interpersonal relations, whereas Dorn's asceticism, I think that's how that word is pronounced, his focus on unilateral leadership emphasized pragmatism and stoicism in his personality. Guilliman's integration of Macragge's culture and exporting that culture to the worlds he conquered contrasts with Dorn's somewhat professional detachment from the traditions of Inuit. Chemos is an interesting world. Chemos, the homeworld of Fulgrim, we talked about earlier. Fulgrim hailed from an advanced, resource-deprived world with some amount of advanced technology. He approached the Emperor with an emphasis on perfection and artistry as what he could offer to the Imperium. Dorn saw duty as an unadorned task to complete, but Fulgrim saw it as an opportunity for beauty and glory, a way to improve the lives of the human citizens of the Imperium. This fundamental difference shaped their trajectories and the vulnerabilities which each had. In contrast, Mortarion grew up on the world of Barbarous, a truly horrible place. Mortarion's first meeting with the Emperor was fraught with a lack of trust and with resentment. He was immediately overshadowed and humiliated by the Emperor's intervention, whereas Dorn's immediate loyalty and submission to the Emperor as his leader contrasted with Mortarion's deep-seated grudge. This highlights Dorn's lack of emotional resistance to joining the Imperium, but also shows a potential vulnerability to blind obedience. Angron, of course, came from Nuceria. After a horrible childhood, Angron's meeting with the Emperor was defined by anger and a sense of betrayal as he was forcibly removed from his gladiatorial brothers, his comrades. Dorn's meeting, marked by pragmatic acceptance, contrasts with Angron's emotional rejection, showing us differences in how the two coped with isolation from others and with a sense of purpose. Dorn's meeting reflects his strengths: steadfast loyalty, focus, and a sense of duty, but also potential blind spots, including emotional rigidity, blind obedience, and difficulty in adapting to nuanced interpersonal dynamics. Similarly to Guilliman and Fulgrim, Dorn's structured upbringing gave him clarity of purpose, but where Guilliman embraced adaptability and interpersonal relations, and Fulgrim pursued personal glory and artistic uplifting of the people, Dorn embodied a stark, isolated, utilitarian interpretation of service. It was a job. He was there to do a job. The contrasts with Mortarion and Angron highlight Dorn's emotional distance. Their defiance to the Emperor came from deep-seated emotional wounds due to interpersonal relations. Mortarion with his adoptive father, and Angron with his brothers. But Dorn didn't have any close emotional ties. His stoicism thus allowed him to avoid later rebellion, but it limited its capacity for personal growth and interpersonal connection. Thus, comparing Dorn's first meeting with the Emperor with those of other Primarchs enriches our understanding of his character. We can see pragmatic loyalty, but also emotional isolation, and some risks to his character, such as blind obedience. There's a thematic diversity among the Primarchs, which shows us how their origins and initial interactions with the Emperor shaped their paths, some towards service to the Imperium, and others leading to the tragedies of the Horus heresy. Did Dorn have any close partners during the Great Crusade? Did the Imperial Fists fight alongside other legions particularly frequently? Well, because he was the Praetorian, his legion, the Imperial Fists, often operated as the Emperor's elite defensive force, and occasionally his personal siege breakers. This made Dorn a deeply loyal servant of the Emperor, but his personal relationships with other Primarchs and the relationships between the Imperial Fists and other legions were complex. Dorn had a reputation for being dutiful, stern, and uncompromising. These traits made him respected, especially on a professional level, but not always warmly regarded. The Imperial Fists fought with the Emperor at the forefront of the Great Crusade, the major theaters of combat. And because of that, they fought most often alongside the Luna Wolves, later the Sons of Horus. Before Horus's fall, Dorn had a professional relationship with Horus, who later became War Master, but even before then held the highest authority among the Primarchs as first among equals. Dorn respected Horus's charisma, leadership, and his ability to strategically position each legion to use their strengths, whereas Horus valued Dorn's reliability and strategic acumen. The two worked closely on major campaigns. Thus, when the Horus heresy began, Dorn took it personally that Horus betrayed him. He channeled this into his unyielding defense of Terra. Dorn and Guilliman shared mutual respect as strategic thinkers and builders of empires, even though they had different approaches to leadership and governance. And on the few times where they interacted, Guilliman's diplomatic adaptability complemented Dorn's strategic skill and defensive expertise. The two would have been well positioned to coordinate on campaigns requiring large-scale logistical efforts and high strategy, which they were both good at. But, one, they were in completely different parts of the galaxy most of the time. And two, Dorn's rigid loyalty to the Emperor occasionally clashed with Guilliman's focus on his own little area of the Imperium, the Ultramar area. Sanguinius, a paragon of virtue and loyalty, was one of the few Primarchs whom Dorn deeply admired. The Imperial Fists and Blood Angels fought side by side during the Great Crusade, particularly in campaigns which required a mix of a strong defensive position, the Imperial Fists, and an elite precision strike, the Blood Angels. In this, the pairing was somewhat similar to the anvil and hammer strategy used by the Death Guard and the Luna Wolves. I wonder where he learned that from. Their relationship became more poignant during the Siege of Terra, where the Blood Angels fought across the galaxy to get to Terra to join their comrades in defense of the Throne World and the Imperial Palace. The Imperial Fists were often deployed in conjunction with certain other legions due to, yes, their expertise in fortifications and sieges, their role as defenders and also as siege breakers, but also just because they were right there in the middle of the Great Crusade with everybody. They were a strategic asset to anybody who fought alongside them, especially in campaigns involving entrenched enemies or planetary defenses. Thus, one of their key collaborating legions were the Iron Warriors. Early in the Crusade, the Imperial Fists worked right alongside the Iron Warriors sometimes. Yes, they had their rivalry, but their methods were complementary. As far as I can tell from canon, Perturabo intentionally moved to remove his legion from fighting alongside the Imperial Fists when he had the opportunity, thus souring any chance of partnership. There were, of course, legions which the Imperial Fists didn't fight alongside very often. The White Scars, the Raven Guard, the Word Bearers, the Alpha Legion. These legions all just sort of haired off on their own to pursue their own compliance operations far away from everyone else independently. Kind of like Ultramar, but smaller scale. But even in the main theaters of war, Dorn's relationships were limited by his stoic nature. He was not naturally inclined to form deep personal bonds, and he didn't really put any effort into it. His intense focus on duty often came across as cold and dismissive, even if he didn't really intend it, and sometimes he did intend it. Meanwhile, his rivalry with Perturabo and his philosophical differences with Leman Russ and Conrad Kurz limited his ability to connect with certain Primarchs closely. And then there's the Emperor's Praetorian, which set him apart from his brothers, both in status and responsibility. We can see kind of a similarity there with Leman Russ as the Emperor's executioner, who thus was separate from his brothers because at any point in the future he might be called upon to kill them. Dorn's separation reinforced his solitary nature and made him seeking out close partnerships less likely. Rogal Dorn and the Imperial Fists thus frequently collaborated with certain other legions during the Great Crusade, but these partnerships were professional, not deeply personal. Dorn's stoicism and unwavering sense of duty created both admiration and distance among his brothers. And yes, while he had respect for and worked closely with other Primarchs like Sanguinius and Horus, his role as the Emperor's Praetorian and his rivalry with Perturabo shaped much of the relationship dynamic that he had with other Primarchs. He never had the close friendship with Horus that Mortarion had, for example, despite fighting alongside the Luna Wolves quite frequently. Now, how did the Emperor and the Custodes act and think towards Dorn and the Imperial Fists as the Great Crusade progressed? They were, especially the Custodes, were acutely aware of the symbolic significance of the Praetorian throughout the Great Crusade. From what I can see in canon, the Emperor and the Custodes had a great deal of respect for Rogal Dorn, and they relied heavily upon the Imperial Fists. They traded on Dorn's reputation as master fortifier and defender, and relied upon his strategic brilliance. This positioned him uniquely within the Imperium, and influenced how he was treated and viewed by the Emperor and his Custodian Guard, even as how they treated him influenced how they would later treat him. It's a cycle. Dorn was one of the Emperor's most trusted Primarchs, thus why he had the title of Praetorian. It symbolized not only his military acumen, but also the emperor's belief in his unshakable loyalty, reliability, and honestly capability. The imperial fists were chosen for critical tasks such as fortifying Terra itself, or when he needed his most brilliant general to be at the forefront of the crusade. Now, this was a mistake. His most brilliant general was Perturabo, and if he had recognized that and acted on it more, Perturabo would have appreciated it, as we already talked about. But whatever. We can see the Emperor's confidence in Dorn's abilities and in the expertise of the Imperial Fists. Dorn's unwavering adherence to duty and the Imperial principles and ideals made him and the Imperial Fists paragons to be held up as symbols of unity and strength. The Emperor viewed him as a symbol just as much as he saw Guilliman and Sanguinius as symbols for everyone else to follow. While the Emperor valued Dorn's loyalty and utility to the Great Crusade, his distant and pragmatic nature limited any deep emotional connection he could have had with his similarly distant and pragmatic son. The Emperor struggled to address Dorn's emotional needs only to the point that struggle implies he put any effort into it. Dorn's fear of failure and his internalized shame from perceived shortcomings were simply unaddressed by the Emperor. The Emperor saw Dorn's idealism and stubbornness as the double-edged sword that they were. They made him steadfast and reliable, yes, but it also rendered him inflexible. He was not dependable on situations that required adaptability or interpersonal relations with other Primarchs. This is why he was never considered for the position of War Master. Not for a moment. Meanwhile, the Custodes, the Emperor's personal bodyguards, shared a special understanding of Dorn's responsibilities as Praetorian. They respected his commitment to defending the Emperor and Terra, and because they had such close contact with him, they had many opportunities to view his strategic brilliance and understand it for what it was. But they had a professional detachment. The Custodes didn't trust anybody. So while they admired Dorn's abilities, they were wary of his inflexible nature. They were individuals who fought as individuals and were devoted entirely to the Emperor's will. They thus viewed Dorn's personal ideals and personal and professional pride separate from the person of the Emperor as potential risks to his effectiveness, though, as far as I can tell in canon, they never worried about his loyalty. The Custodes and Imperial Fists fought alongside each other more often than the Custodes fought alongside any other legion, as far as I can tell. This collaboration fostered mutual respect, but only on a professional level. The Custodes never engaged in interpersonal friendship with anyone, basically, because that would distract them from being focused on the Emperor. As the Great Crusade progressed, the Emperor leaned more and more heavily on Dorn and the Imperial Fists for tasks which required absolute reliability. This reliance further elevated their status, but also increased the pressure on Dorn, feeding his fear of failure. We can see in modern 40k the legacy of what the Emperor did to the Imperial Fists there in, 30,000, leading up into 40,000. The Crimson Fists chapter is the epitome of we've been leaned on too heavily for defense, and we're near breaking point. Anyway, the Emperor's aloofness meant that while Dorn received professional recognition for his work in a way that Perturabo just about never did, He never received the emotional validation he craved. This lack of personal connection may have thus deepened Dorn's sense of isolation and his fixation on proving his worth through his legion's deeds. The Custodes were in a good position to observe the growing tension within Dorn and his legion. They were in a position where they could have recognized the need for emotional intervention, but their role as servants of the Emperor rather than peers to the Astartes and the Primarchs limited their motivation to act meaningfully to draw the Emperor's attention to this stress. They figured their duty is to get through it, they're going to get through it. It happened to be the case that they were correct. The Imperial fists did not break, but boy, they got close. Now, we can compare. Horus received overt favoritism, but Dorn's relationship with the Emperor was rooted in duty and responsibility. The lack of warmth that the Emperor had for Dorn contrasted sharply with the camaraderie that some Primarchs experienced. Notably, Sanguinius and Horus were warm with their brothers in a way that the Emperor was not warm with Dorn. Interestingly, Dorn's dynamic with the Emperor thus bears some resemblance to Perturabo's dynamic. Both of them were given arduous, thankless tasks and struggled under the weight of high expectations. The key differences were Dorn did receive some validation sometimes because he was right there to receive compliments and stuff. And the other is he chose unwavering loyalty, even in the face of great personal and professional hardship, whereas Perturabo did not thus choose. Anyway, the Emperor and the Custodes regarded Dorn and the Imperial Fists with immense respect and entrusted them with some of the Imperium's most critical responsibilities during the Great Crusade. But this was a professional respect. It did not have personal warmth, and thus lacked any emotional support which might have helped to quell some of Dorn's inner turmoil. The Custodes admired Dorn's resolve, but they were limited in their willingness and capacity to address his emotional needs. Thus we see Dorn's rigid sense of duty as both his greatest strength and his deepest vulnerability. This makes him an excellent comparison to Perturabo. The reunion of Dorn with the Imperial Fists was one of profound transformation, marked by an immediate sense of purpose, loyalty to each other, and alignment with their new Primarch's ideals. Dorn's arrival provided the Legion with a clear identity and direction, which had been somewhat loosely defined in the years prior to their reunification. This unity thus catalyzed a restructuring of the Legion's culture and operational philosophy. The Imperial Fists immediately respected Dorn's leadership. Dorn's personal presence, his reputation as a brilliant strategist and indomitable warrior, master of the greatest starship in the Imperium, commanded respect. The Legion immediately recognized him as the embodiment of the discipline and fortitude they valued, and they happily joined in his vision. As opposed to Perturabo, who killed a tenth of his Legion immediately. Dorn's clear vision for the role of the Imperial Fists within the Imperium resonated with the Legion, which had been awaiting such guidance since the Great Crusades started. They were genetically predisposed to value discipline, endurance, and stoicism, because of their Primarch, of course. He was thus the epitome of the traits they valued in themselves. This ideological alignment fostered a strong bond between the Primarch and his warriors. Dorn's emphasis on defensive warfare and mastery of fortification became core tenets of the Legion's identity, reshaping their operational doctrine to reflect his expertise. Before uniting with Dorn, the Imperial Fists had fought dutifully, but lacked a clear, defining purpose. Under Dorn, they became the Imperium's foremost fortifiers and defenders, a role which they embraced with pride and carried forward to the modern 40K as a chapter. This newfound purpose instilled a sense of pride and camaraderie within the Legion, which bound them together unified under Dorn's leadership. As Praetorian, Dorn's appointment thus elevated the Imperial Fists to a position of symbolic importance within the Imperium. The Legion saw this as both an honor and a responsibility, further solidifying their loyalty to Dorn and the Emperor, but also leaving a crack in the Legion. This newfound prestige came with the expectation of flawless performance, which created additional pressure on the Legion, and it made for a difficult time in reconciling the offensive mission of the Great Crusade with their personal focus on defense. What happened with that later was that the Iron Cage happened, splitting the Legion into chapters, and those offensively minded portions of the Imperial Fists split off under Sigismund to become the Black Templars. In contrast with the Iron Warriors, who grew resentful under Perturabo's harsh and demanding leadership. Remember, he killed 1/10 of them immediately upon meeting them. The Imperial Fists thrived under Dorn's discipline and personal principles. Dorn inspired loyalty and respect, whereas Perturabo had been taught by his adoptive father to create fear and bitterness in doing one's duty. Similar to Guilliman transforming the Ultramarines into a model of both governance and military efficiency, Dorn reshaped the Imperial Fists into a paragon of his style of warfare. Both legions embraced their Primarch's visions wholeheartedly, but perhaps Guilliman's diplomatic skills made his relationship with his legion more personal. We can also compare to the World Eaters. Angron's arrival put the World Eaters on a path of descent into brutality, whereas Dorn's unification with the Imperial Fists refined and elevated their discipline and strategy, channeling their efforts into constructive military effort rather than the World Eaters' destructive chaos. Thus, as with all of the legions, the unification of the Imperial Fists with their Primarch was the pivotal moment that defined the legion's role during the Great Crusade. Dorn's leadership provided them with a clear identity, fostering loyalty, pride, and a deep sense of purpose. This transformation strengthened the Legion and solidified their position as one of the Imperium's most reliable and publicly revered forces. Unlike some other Primarch-Legion relationships, Dorn's alignment with the Imperial Fists was almost seamless, demonstrating the power of shared values and of mutual respect. What were the internal politics of the Imperial Fists? The internal politics of the Imperial Fists Legion were largely defined by their culture of discipline, duty, and loyalty, which were direct reflections of Rogal Dorn's character and leadership style. Unlike many other legions, the Imperial Fists were less prone to infighting or political maneuvering, or basing one's worth or political affiliation off of one's homeworld. But they still had unique internal dynamics shaped by their rigid hierarchy and the demanding standards Dorn set for them. Now, it's worth noting that the Imperial Fists have a number of interesting cultural practices, such as the Junker model of Prussian military order, taking noms de guerre for battle brothers and naming companies after sections of the Imperial Palace that they defended during the Horus Heresy, fighting honor duels, the use of the Pain Glove, and scrimshawing the bones of their dead. But none of that really bears upon what we might call political division. The most notable feature of their legion's politics, we might call it, is their strict hierarchy and meritocracy. The Imperial Fists maintained a rigid chain of command, with promotions and assignments based strictly on merit and demonstrated ability, and Rogal Dorn resisted the use of, first, the chaplains, which certain legions adopted from Lorgar's word-bearers, and also the librarians, both of which were outside of the chain of command, so he was uncomfortable with them. The meritocracy and chain of command reduced favoritism or internal rivalries over rank, as advancement was learned through loyalty and proven skill in battle. Dorn had a perfectionist streak, and the expectation of flawless performance created immense pressure within the Legion. We earlier mentioned the Junker model of behavior. This is that. The pressure, while motivating for many, could lead to internal self-criticism or feelings of inadequacy among warriors who failed to meet the Legion's exacting standards. That's where the pain glove comes in. When your mind cannot be quieted through other means, you use the glove. The Legion had a cultural emphasis on duty and unity, prioritizing collective goals over individual ambition. This discouraged personal rivalries or political cliques, and it helped to avoid the sort of backstabbing in order to try to gain promotion that was seen in certain other legions, which we talked about elsewhere. The Fists' shared dedication to duty and their role as defenders of the Imperium fostered a strong sense of unity and camaraderie within them. Dorn instituted rigorous tests to ensure the quality of his warriors, and those who failed to meet expectations were reassigned to different roles, maybe demoted, or in the earliest days of Anastartes' induction, they might just be eliminated from service, used for gene seed farming instead. The culture of constant testing reinforced the Legion's overall excellence, but left little room for vulnerability or personal weakness, and perhaps may have dissuaded them from experimentation. After all, if you're trying something new, there's a chance it might go wrong. The Imperial Fists exhibited a genetic and cultural, near fanatical loyalty to Dorn, who was both their guiding figure and their harshest critic. This loyalty could create internal friction if individual Marines felt alienated by Dorn's exacting standards or perceived favoritism towards those who exemplified his ideals. But the bigger risk is that if Dorn fell, he would have dragged his entire legion with him. It just happens that he didn't, and we'll talk about that later. While most of the Legion embraced Dorn's perfectionism, some Marines who struggled with his standards may have felt undervalued or alienated. I don't see evidence in canon of these individuals acting out as a result of such feelings due to the Legion's strong emphasis of discipline and unity, but the internalized resentment could create subtle rifts. I think we see that in certain honor duels that we see throughout canon, where the main character, who's like the great one, ends up fighting someone else because the someone else doesn't feel like they're living up to it. They lash out. Although the Legion was ostensibly unified, there was that sort of unspoken competition among officers and squads to win the approval of those higher up the hierarchy, ultimately Dorn. This competition occasionally led to friction, though it was generally overshadowed by their shared commitment to the Legion's goals. Early in the Legion's history, there is some limited canonical evidence for minor divisions between Terran origin Marines and those recruited from Inuit. But also that depends heavily on canon, because in certain canon, as mentioned before, Inuit hadn't been thought of yet by Games Workshop, so the home world of the Imperial Fists was just Terra. That's where they took Marines from. In any case, Dorn's firm leadership, the shared culture of discipline and duty, and lack of imagination on the part of the authors of the Horus Heresy series helped to quickly integrate the various groups of the Imperial Fists into a cohesive force. All of this contrasts greatly with the Iron Warriors, whose internal politics were characterized by resentment, competition for Perturabo's approval, and sometimes outright backstabbing each other in order to try to advance. The Imperial Fists fostered a culture of mutual respect and shared purpose, which Perturabo did not. The Imperial Fists and Ultramarines both value discipline and cohesion, but while the Ultramarines rely upon Guilliman's top-down organizational structure, the Imperial Fists depend on Dorn's personal example. They want to be like Dorn. The exact structure their chapter takes after the second founding depends on their interpretation of Dorn. We can see this with the Crimson Fists taking one view of Dorn as a more honestly kind of stupid warrior who would fight to the death for little reason, and the Black Templars adopting Dorn's hatred of Psykers. But, in any case, the internal politics of the Imperial Fists' Legion were defined by their shared values of discipline, unity, and unyielding loyalty to Dorn and the Imperium. Their rigid hierarchy and high standards could create internal pressures within individual Marines, but these were overshadowed by their commitment to the Legion's collective goals. The Imperial Fists' culture was thus a testament to Dorn's leadership, fostering a near unbreakable unity that allowed them to excel as defenders of the Imperium. What can we learn about the character of Dorn from his period of early interstellar leadership, such as his victories against the Orcs and his campaign against a Xenos threat suspected to have been Necrons on Necromunda? Rogal Dorn's period of early interstellar leadership offers key insights into his character and his values as a Primarch. His actions during this time reflect his unyielding sense of duty, discipline, and commitment to order, as well as his pragmatism and willingness to sacrifice for the greater good. These traits became hallmarks of his leadership, and they inform the culture of the Imperial Fists Legion and successor chapters. Let's take a look at some of this. Dorn's notable successes against the Orcs demonstrate his skill in deploying methodical and disciplined strategies against a disorganized and overwhelming foe. His campaigns exemplify his belief in the value of preparation, precision, and order, especially against this enemy that thrived on brute force and unpredictability. While Dorn is often associated with fortifications and defensive warfare, he knew full well that the best defense is a good offense. His legion was quite prepared for offensive campaigns to kill the Orcs, thus speaking to his versatility. Though, even on the attack, Dorn approached warfare with the mindset of a defender, ensuring that his lines were secure against enemy counterattack, and if his forces were, in effect, a wall which happened to be advancing on the enemy. Dorn's ability to overcome orc hordes, despite their numbers and ferocity, brings us to mind historical examples like the Romans fighting the Celts. They highlight his determination and refusal to give up on his order and need for discipline in the face of adversity. He focused on long-term victory, even at significant cost, thus aligning with his belief that sacrifice is necessary for the greater good. And he focused on overall organization and overall victory rather than the opportunity for personal glory, which we see with, for example, the Space Wolves. Now, Necromunda is a complicated thing in canon, but roughly speaking, they had a set of portals connecting Necromunda to nearby worlds, thus making them not need to use starships to travel between them. Then, after the Imperial Fists brought them into compliance, a strange enemy emerged from the portals and attacked everyone. Sounds like Necrons to me. So if the Xenos threat on Necromunda was indeed Necrons, which is unclear in canon, Dorn was facing an enemy vastly different from the Orcs, silent, unrelenting, and vastly more technologically advanced than the Imperium. Thus, his campaign demonstrated his ability to adapt to new forms of warfare, needing to assess threats with unknown capabilities and motives. Thus we can see his insistence on understanding and controlling his environment come to the fore. Necromunda, even before its current incarnation, was still a fractured, dangerous environment. Dorn's campaign against the Xenos threat there required imposing order on a chaotic situation, and his success on Necromunda thus reinforces his role as a bringer of stability, and his belief that the Imperium's order is a bulwark against annihilation by the Xenos. It wasn't such a large campaign as to threaten to destroy the Imperium overall, like the orcs of Urlak-Urg or the Rangdan. But still, it was a high point in the Imperial Fist's compliance campaigns. We know very little from canon about the exact events of the compliance campaigns on Necromunda, which is really a shame, because it'd be great. These campaigns in the early days of Dorn's participation in the Great Crusade exemplified Dorn's belief in duty above all else, that the defense of humanity and the Imperium is the highest calling no matter the cost. His ability to achieve victory against diverse foes shows his relentless dedication to this purpose. And it's strange to think of him as being particularly flexible given his reputation, but he does indeed show flexibility in tactics in fighting these vastly different foes. Dorn's focus on discipline, order, and the cohesion of his forces became the cornerstone of his legion's identity, and then later the Imperial Fist chapter and many of their successor chapters, thus ensuring their effectiveness in even the most challenging circumstances. This emphasis on unity reflects his belief that humanity can only survive through collective effort and unyielding resolve. Dorn's reliance on structure and order, while a strength, also foreshadowed his eventual inability to adapt to unorthodox situations in certain situations. His insistence on perfect execution and control hinted at the rigidity of thought that would sometimes alienate others, such as Conrad Kors and Perturabo, and also hinted at the weakness in his leadership, which Perturabo would exploit in the Iron Cage campaign, causing Rogal Dorn to bring his legion into what was obviously a trap, even though he knew it was a trap. Now, like Guilliman, Dorn was focused on bringing stability and order to disordered, chaotic environments. Guilliman's approach, though, had an administrative side to things, while Dorn's was more military-based. He was more the Ferrus Manus type to just win a war and then leave it for the humans. He would establish a place to recruit, yes, but he would not take tithes like, for example, the Ultramarines or the Iron Warriors. He didn't want to rule them. In contrast to Russ's direct, instinctual leadership, Dorn's leadership was more about meticulous planning and leading by example as a bulwark of order, and Corax's focus on guerrilla tactics contrasts with Dorn's emphasis on structure and traditional military discipline, thus highlighting the different approaches to warfare that we see throughout the Great Crusade. Dorn's early interstellar leadership and grand victories against very different Xenos races reveals a Primarch of unwavering discipline, tactical brilliance, and profound commitment to the ideals of the Imperium. He was able to impose order on chaos and adapt to diverse threats, but also we can see the emotional cost of his perfectionism and rigidity of thinking that would later shape certain of his later actions. His character embodies the duality of strength and burden inherent in his role as the Emperor's Praetorian. Rogal Dorn's emotional needs during his early interstellar leadership were shaped by his stoic personality, deep sense of duty, and unyielding loyalty to the Emperor. His role as a paragon of fortification and defense reflected not only his pragmatic skills, but also the underlying emotional needs that drove him. Dorn prided himself on his steadfastness, honesty, and sense of honor, and during his early leadership he sought validation for his unwavering commitment to these values. He needed assurance that his rigid adherence to duty and truth was valued, especially as his moral absolutism sometimes alienated him from his fellow Primarchs, who saw him as stuck up and cold. He wasn't exactly like asking outright, "Please, tell me you appreciate me," but he didn't turn away when he was offered that sort of validation. He didn't see himself as above it like Perturabo did. Dorn's identity was deeply tied to his role as the Emperor's Praetorian. He needed to feel that his work directly contributed to the greater good and the Emperor's vision for humanity by being the one the Emperor called upon for his own personal actions in the Great Crusade. This purpose-driven need made him strive to embody perfection in his duties, ensuring the Imperium's survival and protection and success in the Great Crusade. But Dorn's campaigns sometimes recovered immense sacrifice, both from himself and his legion. His emotional need for acknowledgement thus extended not only to his achievement, but also to the cost of those successes. Every Primarch dealt with massive losses for those under their control, for those under their command at some point or other. The toll of the responsibilities of a Primarch was significant, and they all needed reassurance that these sacrifices were both necessary and appreciated. We can see what happens when they were not in the previous thing, talking about Perturabo. Now, while not as emotionally open as many of his brothers, Dorn did value camaraderie and mutual respect. He needed to feel that he was part of a larger whole, trusted and respected by his brothers and the Emperor alike. His rigidity, high standards, and certain vaguely autistic traits created friction, making it harder for him to establish close bonds, and making it harder for him to meet his brothers emotionally, like with Conrad Kors. But Dorn did seek trust from his peers and from the Emperor. He needed the Emperor and his brothers to rely on him and to respect his judgment. Micromanagement or questioning his methods would have been deeply frustrating to him, undermining his confidence. And when Perturabo, for example, told him that the Imperial Palace could indeed be breached by the Iron Warriors during a hypothetical brought up by Horus, Rogal Dorn did not take that well. Dorn's need for validation and trust made him intolerant of perceived failure, either in himself or in his legion, even in a hypothetical. This could lead to excessive self-criticism, a harsh approach to discipline, and also reacting poorly to outside criticism. Dorn's stoic demeanor, though, masked his deeper emotional needs, making it difficult for others to understand or address them. Over time, this suppression may have contributed to internalized frustration and isolation. It just happens that he received enough validation and support as the Emperor's Praetorian that was enough for him. Dorn's high expectations, uncompromising nature, and laser view on order created tension with his brothers, especially more unorthodox Primarchs, with a different fighting style for their legion. Now, what was helping Dorn, though? Well, regular recognition of his actions and his legion's achievements and their importance to the Imperium bolstered morale and reduced Dorn's tendency towards self-imposed isolation. If he occasionally got validation by being near the Emperor and his brothers and various Imperial commanders and stuff, then he seeks out those opportunities for connection. Efforts to foster stronger relationships with his brothers, particularly those who shared similar values like Guilliman, might have provided him with greater emotional support, but neither of them were going to do that. Dorn needed to be able to delegate responsibilities, thus allowing Dorn to focus on grand strategic designs rather than micromanaging every aspect of his legion. Thankfully, he felt confident in trusting in the competence of his Marines, and that eased his burdens. In summary, then, we can see Rogal Dorn's emotional needs revolving around validation, trust, purpose, and connection. His stoic nature and kind of standoffish personality obscured those needs somehow, but understanding them provides insight into the challenges he faced and the ways in which the Emperor and his brothers did support him as the Emperor's Praetorian, but also might have supported him more effectively had they been more aware. In 40k canon, what notable actions of the Imperial Fists were there prior to the Horus Heresy? Well, the Imperial Fists participated in several notable campaigns and actions during the Great Crusade prior to the Horus Heresy, but canonical details are sparse. The information we do have about these campaigns highlights the nature of the Legion and provides context for their later actions during the Horus Heresy and the Siege of Terra. Dorn kept his legion on the front lines as much as he was able, pausing after a conquest only long enough to fortify and begin recruitment before moving on to the next world. He did not want to be an administrator of them. Meanwhile, the Emperor liked to keep part of the Imperial Fists as strategic reserves, able to use the phalanx to quickly move a plurality of the strength of a legion to a war zone in need of reinforcement. This made them, interestingly, a rapid response force more effectively than, for example, a more mobile legion like the White Scars, just because the phalanx was so powerful as a single entity and could carry so many Marines. The most notable action of the Imperial Fists during the Great Crusade was the various fighting at Necromunda, though canon is unclear, as we mentioned earlier. In one version of canon, that area of the galaxy had been overrun by orcs, so Rogal Dorn himself led the Imperial Fists in war to liberate those worlds from the foul Xenos, ultimately leading to the Necromundan holiday of Fistmas. Old Games Workshop was big on puns. In a different version of canon, the world, then called Arranius Prime, was overawed by the overwhelming naval strength of a force led by Hashin Yonad of the Imperial Fists. So the leaders of Arranius Prime surrendered peacefully. But then following that compliance effort, the worlds of the Arranius continuity, remember, linked by portals, were attacked by a mysterious Xenos species which emerged from the portals which connected each world. Sounds like Necrons. The Imperial Fists then fought to defend the newly compliant worlds and were barely able to save Arranius Prime alone. Again, to me, the evidence points towards these being Necron dolmen gates and Necrons fighting against the Imperial Fists. The Necromunda campaign, regardless of which version you go with, demonstrates Dorn's ability to restore order to a fractured, disordered environment, which became a hallmark of the Legion. Now, other actions, Dorn fought alongside the Space Wolves, possibly at Castoris. The Imperial Fists fought a defensive war in the Adonis cluster against a Xenos species called the Zahelican breed, but little is described in canon. The Imperial Fists were also sometimes assigned to frontier regions of the Imperium, including the Eastern Fringe, which I feel is a strange choice by the authors, because they were mostly right there with the Emperor in the main theaters of war. But whatever, a legion is big, you can assign some of them somewhere else. These various campaigns required the Legion to operate independently and showcase their ability to fortify and hold newly compliant worlds against Xenos incursions or internal rebellion. Now, because they were the Emperor's Praetorians, right there in the middle of the main theaters of the Great Crusade, the Imperial Fists often fought alongside, or at least near, other legions. They had a well-documented rivalry with the Iron Warriors, primarily due to their overlapping expertise in fortifications and siegecraft. They also occasionally cooperated with the Ultramarines, as their shared emphasis on discipline and order made them natural allies in certain campaigns. But usually the Ultramarines were off fighting on their own, geographically separated. Their role as the Emperor's Praetorian Guard meant that they were frequently called upon as mobile reserves to bring the phalanx in to defend key installations. We should perhaps talk about the phalanx a little more. The phalanx, the Imperial Fist's massive star fortress, was both a symbol of their might and also the single greatest strategic asset in the Great Crusade. It was both a mobile base of operations and the most powerful starship, a potent weapon of war which allowed the Legion to respond rapidly to threats across the galaxy. The phalanx's presence often shifted the tide of entire campaigns, being able to bring a plurality of the strength of the Imperial Fist's Legion into a system all at once. No need to set up long lines of logistics ahead of time. This made it an essential part of the Imperial Fist's identity. We can see this same sort of overarching strategy used in some of the Battlefleet Gothic background books, where they talk about the use of Ramillies-class star forts. Less mobile, less powerful than the Phalanx. Still the same idea. It's a forward base for repair and refit. Now, the Imperial Fists were heavily involved in securing the recently conquested worlds of the nascent Imperium, thus often tasked with missions which temporarily isolated them from other legions as the forefront of the Great Crusade moved on past them. This isolation, combined with the demands placed on them as the Emperor's Praetorian Guard, foreshadowed some of the tensions that would emerge during the Horus Heresy, particularly the rivalry with the Iron Warriors. The Iron Warriors, of course, would garrison long-term, whereas the Imperial Fists just set up fortifications and then moved on. Their unyielding commitment to duty and their strong bond with Dorn set the stage for their unwavering loyalty during the oncoming Horus Heresy. The other big important thing to remember is that they were the Emperor's Praetorians. They were responsible for fortifying Terra, the Sol system, the Imperial Palace. So after the triumph at Ullanor, when the Emperor returned to Terra, he brought the Imperial Fists with him, taking the bulk of their legion away from the Great Crusade, which both placed them outside of the influence of Horus, but also was perceived as a distinct honor, which was directly lauded by Horus in one of his early actions as War Master. But we'll talk about the schism between Dorn and Perturabo a little more later. Overall, the Imperial Fist's actions prior to Ullanor demonstrate their unwavering commitment to the ideals of the Great Crusade. They were the Emperor's defenders, entrusted with the most critical and dangerous tasks, often operating independently from other legions because they were right there with the Emperor, but also occasionally having portions of their legion in isolation, garrisoning or fortifying newly compliant worlds, or having their forces be moved into the main theaters of the Great Crusade as mobile reserves. They had plenty of opportunity to fight alongside other legions at the forefront of the Great Crusade, when their reserves were called in to help with someone else, of course. And thus, the campaigns not only honed their skills, reinforced their legion culture of discipline, sacrifice, and duty, but also ensured that they were seen doing these things by other legions and other Primarchs and the Emperor, allowing them to get a sort of passive exposure to validation of their deeds, which the Iron Warriors mostly rejected when it was offered, and also notably had less opportunity to be exposed to. Let's take a little more look at the Imperial Fist's occasional recruitment from a variety of worlds in comparison to legions which are tied more closely to one homeworld, such as the Salamanders or the Iron Hands. This difference in structure, I feel, has significant implications for the character of their legion and their relationship to the Imperium. We can't really talk about this without talking about the Phalanx. It's a massive and ancient star fortress from the Dark Age of technology. It was central to the Imperial Fist's operations during the Great Crusade and Horus Heresy. Its use as a mobile base provided the Legion with unique advantages compared to legions which were more dependent on their home world to supply them over long logistics trains. They had strategic mobility, allowing the Imperial Fists to operate across the galaxy without being anchored to a single location, making them able to rapidly respond to crises and to establish fortifications in distant theaters of war much more quickly than could be accomplished with just a fleet of smaller starships. Besides that, it was a symbol of the Imperium's power, a physical manifestation of the Imperial Fist's expertise in fortification and defense, and a mighty battleship able to swat enemies away that come to attack it, which we see in the Battlefleet Gothic 2 video game. Its presence in a war zone acted as a deterrent to enemies and a rallying point for Imperial forces. If the Phalanx was in orbit around a planet, you did not want to try to reinforce your forces on that world, having to run the gauntlet of getting past the Phalanx. The Phalanx's vast size and internal facilities allowed the Legion to maintain a degree of autonomy. It could house armories, training facilities, vast numbers of personnel, huge amounts of material and supplies, thus reducing their dependence on any particular planet or system for resupply or recruitment, and allowing them to, in effect, undergo an internal siege, draining down their supplies over time, instead of needing to constantly defend some sort of supply wagon or logistics train of warp-borne transports coming into whatever system they were in. They could resupply after the war was done. The Imperial Fists recruited from a wide range of world rather than relying on a single homeworld. This had several effects on the Legion. Recruits from different worlds brought a variety of martial traditions and perspectives to the Legion, thus helping them to be adaptable to new circumstances, but it was tempered by the strict discipline imposed by the Legion's culture, thus ensuring monolithic unity despite their varied origins. Recruitment from multiple worlds, which the Imperial Fists had brought into compliance, ensured a steady supply of aspirants who were eager to join, and it meant that if a recruitment world was lost to war or rebellion, they had other sources. They weren't, for example, the Dark Angels, entirely reliant on Caliban. This model provided the Legion with greater resilience compared to legions which relied on a single homeworld. But without a singular homeworld to anchor their identity, the Imperial Fists had to form a central identity elsewhere. They could not just be the Space Wolves basing their whole thing on Fenris, you know? The Imperial Fists thus derived their sense of self from their discipline, their duty to the Emperor, the symbol of the Phalanx, and their attempting to imitate their mentor Dorn. This contributed to their unyielding focus on service to the Imperium, but it also may have fostered a sense of detachment or rootlessness compared to legions which were more closely tied to their homeworld. Legions tied to a specific homeworld often developed distinct cultural traits and identities based on their homeworld's environment and cultural traditions, which provided great strength to them. We can see this very effectively with the Iron Hands, the Salamanders, and the Space Wolves. The Imperial Fists, by contrast, defined their culture more by their duty and by the example of their Primarch, rather than by any of their individual planetary cultures from among their recruits. The Salamanders were strongly tied to their volcanic homeworld, naming themselves after the greatest beast of that homeworld. They had a culture of self-sacrifice and humanitarianism, which reflected the hardships of Nocturne's people. The savage environment of Fenris instilled in the Space Wolves a almost feral warrior ethos and a strong sense of kinship, aping the cultural clan practices of the people of Fenris. And the nomadic and harsh lifestyle of Medusa's tribes influenced the Iron Hand's focus on resilience, strength, and technology to such an effective degree that Ferrus Manus would bring recruits to Medusa before later making them into Space Marine aspirants. The Imperial Fist's lack of a singular homeworld made them more, perhaps, focused on their duty, but it also meant that they lacked a unifying cultural anchor beyond their service to the Emperor. This was a source of strength which they could not call upon. Their identity instead had to be defined by their role as the Emperor's Praetorians, rather than the traditions of a planet. This, I'll say, did tie in well with their use of the phalanx to project power across the galaxy without being tied to a single location. It provided strategic resilience. By recruiting from multiple worlds, the Legion could maintain its strength even in the face of catastrophic losses of any single recruitment source. I direct you again to the example of the Dark Angels. And it meant that they had to subsume the diversity of cultures from among their recruits under a strict culture of discipline and duty to make a cohesive fighting force despite varied origins. There are many ways that this model could have gone wrong for them. The lack of a singular homeworld thus limited the Legion's ability to build strong connections with the populations they protected. Not only were they themselves cut off from the source of strength of a planetary culture, they were cut off from that source of empathy with humanity as well. Meanwhile, the Phalanx's centrality to the Legion's strategy made it a critical vulnerability. Its loss would have been devastating, and operating from a mobile base may have fostered a sense of rootlessness from the wider Imperium, compared to legions which were more deeply embedded in Imperial society, notably the Ultramarines. Overall, the Imperial Fist's reliance on the Phalanx and recruitment from a wide variety of worlds set them apart from many other legions, highlighting their strategic adaptability and contributing to their identity, while also forcing them to subsume human-based cultures under unyielding discipline and a monolithic legion duty. It presented unique challenges, particularly in terms of cultural cohesion and emotional connection, which thankfully were mitigated by the shared purpose of the Legion and by Rogal Dorn's leadership and example. This approach reflected and built on their pragmatic, duty-bound ethos, aligning them closely with their role as the Emperor's Praetorians. That is, they did not have loyalty to a home world, so instead they had loyalty to the Emperor. But it also made for some weaknesses, which thankfully were not to prove ultimately fatal to their loyalty in the Horus Heresy. Now, in the lead-up to the Horus Heresy, the schism between Perturabo and Dorn is the most significant rivalry. There were others, the World Eaters and Blood Angels, for example, but theirs was the most bitter. They were the Michigan and OSU of the legions. It underscored their opposing philosophies in warfare and revealed deep emotional undercurrents that shaped the relationship not just of their Primarchs, but of their legions. The Imperial Palace on Terra, a sprawling and near impenetrable fortress, was the ultimate symbol of the Emperor's power and vision of humanity. Dorn, as one of the two greatest siege masters from among the Primarchs, was the natural choice for its fortification. As the Emperor's Praetorian, Dorn was entrusted with overseeing the palace's defenses, especially when the Emperor pulled back to Terra and brought the Imperial Fists with him. His role of fortifying the Imperial Palace, Terra, and Sol overall symbolized his unwavering loyalty and his belief in the nobility of defense and protection. Perturabo, meanwhile, was the preeminent expert in siegecraft, and so he felt slighted when Dorn was chosen over him as the Praetorian. To him, this decision reflected the Emperor's lack of recognition for his strategic genius, and the decision thus became a focal point for their rivalry and a source of simmering resentment in Perturabo, which came to a head when, before the Imperial Fists pulled back to Terra, Horus openly praised them in front of Perturabo. Alright, so the great schism here. After a great victory, Horus openly praised Dorn's defensive prowess and the fortifications of the Imperial Palace. He asks Perturabo whether he believed the palace to be safe even from the Iron Warriors. It seems like Horus was hoping for a moment of camaraderie. There are any number of things Perturabo could have said in that moment. Well, let's hope it never comes to that. Or, it would be the most difficult battle of my legion for certain. Or, we would never assault it. We would be too busy killing Xenos on the front lines while the Imperial Fists were manning the walls or some such. But Perturabo was not one for subtlety or emotional intelligence. So instead, what he said, I don't have precise words. I don't think there's like a quote in canon. It's only told from the perspective of people who heard this. Anyway, what he said was something along the lines of, I could defeat his defenses. What I have read from the admittedly older canonical source, what Perturabo meant was, it can still be improved, let me help. But Dorn also was never skilled at subtlety or emotional intelligence, so instead he flipped his shit, just like he would later do with Kurz, and he accused Perturabo of plotting treason. Fucking fantastic, guys. You two ruined a perfectly good dinner party. At least Horus was there to stop Perturabo from beating the stuffing out of Dorn, like how Kurz later almost killed Dorn. This dispute between Perturabo and Dorn over the palace's defenses was not merely technical. It was the deeper philosophical divide. Dorn believed in building an unyielding bastion, one that could inspire hope and demonstrate the strength of the Imperium. He believed that the Imperial Fists were that bastion. He believed that the palace was that bastion. He believed that the phalanx was that bastion. He even believed that the idea of the Imperial Fists was that bastion. His focus was on creating defenses that symbolized stability and order, a fortress that could outlast any siege because it existed in the minds of the imperial citizenry. Perturabo, meanwhile, emphasized practicality and the inevitability of siege warfare's brutal realities. He did not have time for idealistic bullshit. He criticized Dorn's fortifications as overly rigid and symbolic rather than being purely functional, believing, rightly, that they prioritized Dorn's pride and the symbolism of it over effectiveness. These two perspectives highlighted their contrasting approaches to warfare, Dorn's idealism versus pragmatism. And Dorn only started to revamp how the defenses of the Imperial Palace and Terra and Sol were going to work after Istvan, when he got word from the flight of the Eisenstein that he was going to be fighting against Perturabo. He had to redo everything. He knew that the disagreement between them was more than professional rivalry. It was deeply personal. Perturabo was coming for Dorn. But, hold on. Back to the Great Crusade. Not yet talking about the Horus Heresy. Perturabo felt that his expertise was being dismissed or undervalued, reinforcing his long-standing grievances about the lack of recognition for the Iron Warriors' sacrifices. He knew that Dorn's appointment as Praetorian was yet another example of favoritism on the part of the Emperor, a slight that fed into his bitterness towards the Emperor and his brothers. Meanwhile, Dorn's pride in his role as Praetorian and his association between himself and the emperor made him unreceptive to Perturabo's criticisms. He believed that any criticism of the emperor was necessarily a criticism of Dorn, and vice versa. His unwavering belief in his own vision for the palace defenses thus came across as arrogant and dismissive of Perturabo's expertise, which it was. This clash of egos deepened the already existing enmity between them, with neither willing to compromise or acknowledge the other's perspective, and being a source of substantial fallout in the lead-up to the Horus Heresy. Their animosity became a defining aspect of their characters, each viewing the other as the embodiment of what they despised the most, and this bled directly into how their legions treated each other. Perturabo and the Iron Warriors saw Dorn as the Emperor's pampered favorite, while Dorn and the Imperial Fists saw Perturabo as a bitter, overly cynical, untrustworthy Primarch. This rivalry filtered down to their legions, with the Imperial Fists and Iron Warriors developing a mutual hatred which persists to present-day 40k. This animosity was particularly evident in the battles between the two legions during and after the Horus Heresy, but we'll talk about the Iron Cage later. The impact on the Horus Heresy was pretty straightforward. Perturabo's resentment and hatred of Dorn was a key factor in his eventual decision to side with Horus. Horus was able to use Perturabo's hatred of Dorn as a bargaining chip. He was able to tell Perturabo, you'll have the opportunity to defeat Dorn. Perturabo had glee at the opportunity to prove himself able to besiege the Imperial Palace. Dorn's focus on defending the palace was the central point of the Siege of Terra, where his vision and stubbornness were both tested to their limits, and still they were about to be overcome, except for the events of the very end, which, we'll talk about when we get to Horus and stuff. The schism between Perturabo and Dorn serves as a microcosm of the Horus Heresy's broader themes. Perturabo longed for validation, and his growing bitterness highlighted the destructive potential of unaddressed emotional wounds. Horus was able to take advantage of that to bring Perturabo to his side by saying, hey, you'll get a chance to prove yourself in a way that I will recognize and appreciate, like how the Emperor never did. Dorn's idealistic approach to defense contrasts sharply with Perturabo's practical, if cynical, perspective on siegecraft, reflecting the broader tension between the Emperor's vision and the realities of the galaxy. And this dispute was the most clear of the toxic dynamics among the Primarchs. Their sibling rivalry, their competitiveness, their emotional scars drove wedges between them and their legions. The rivalry between Perturabo and Dorn can be contrasted with other sibling dynamics among the Primarchs, allowing us to learn more about each of them. Angron and Sanguinius, their conflict stemmed from fundamentally different values and professional rivalry. Angron believing in the brutality of straightforward violence, and Sanguinius wanting something more refined to uplift his legion. Guilliman and Alfarius, of course, we'll talk about much later. Their philosophical dispute over the nature of what the Astartes are for mirrors in some ways the ideological divide between Dorn and Perturabo, but it lacked quite the amount of personal bitterness. Overall, we can see that the schism between Perturabo and Dorn was the worst of the sibling rivalries among the Primarchs. It encapsulates the tragedy of the Horus Heresy, a conflict rooted in deeply personal grievances, exacerbated by their inability to reconcile or communicate effectively. The rivalry not only shaped their fates, It not only symbolized the broader fractures within the Imperium and the Primarch's relationships, it also dragged the entire galaxy down to their level, forcing everyone to fight over this petty bullshit. Some of the Primarchs who had more offensive or diplomatic-oriented campaigns assigned to them by the Emperor, and later by War Master Horus, occasionally indulged in rivalry and competition with each other regarding the speed and number of their victories. Russ, Lionel Johnson, Gilliman, Jagatai Khan, and occasionally even Fulgrim were known for this sort of usually friendly rivalry. I question, did the nature of siege warfare and defensive warfare make that type of friendly rivalry more difficult for Perturabo and Dorn in addition to their personalities? I believe so. It not only made it more difficult, it also was exacerbated by their personalities, like we just talked about. This all came together to make a more acrimonious and deeply personal rivalry, rather than one which could be rooted in mutual respect or camaraderie. After all, if two legions are both fighting to conquer the greatest number of worlds in a decade or whatever, then at the end of the competition, even if one legion comes out ahead, they'll still say, by the way, good job on conquering all those worlds, to the other legion. That's the big problem, though. Offensive campaigns tend to involve swift, decisive action, allowing for quick results and tangible metrics of success. Worlds conquered, enemies defeated. In a diplomatic campaign, you get the same thing. How fast can you bring this system into compliance by talking to them? Sieges and defensive campaigns, by contrast, are protracted and grinding, with success measured in endurance and attrition rather than dramatic victories. Victory comes with a slow, grinding halt as the enemy is finally rooted out in the last pocket, or as the enemy finally decides to call it quits and stops attacking. This makes it harder to quantify or boast about some one single big success in a way that lends itself to friendly competition. Similarly, offensive warfare is associated with glory and heroism. There was a triumph after the Olenor campaign. There was not a triumph after the First Rangdan Xenocides. Sieges and defensive actions were seen by the Great Crusade as less glamorous, even though they were just as essential. Both Perturabo and Dorn felt that their work was underappreciated compared to their brother's more celebrated accomplishments. It's just that Dorn, by fighting near his brothers more often, had more opportunity for them to see what he was doing, so he still got some validation. Defensive campaigns and sieges could require the legions to remain in static positions for extended periods, reducing opportunities for interaction or collaboration with other legions. It had to wait until Dorn and the Phalanx were pulled away to go reinforce some other place, where they would fight alongside the Space Wolves or whatever. This isolation thus reinforced more so the sense of alienation for Perturabo rather than just Dorn. They both struggled with interpersonal connections, but Dorn at least had more interpersonal exposure. Thus, Perturabo's innate bitterness and desire for validation worked alongside the limitations of siege campaigns to make him ill-suited to friendly competition. He craved recognition for his skill, but he interpreted others' accomplishments as slights against him. His meticulous and perfectionist nature, along with his terrible father, led him to view even the most constructive rivalry as an affront. Remember, when his adoptive brother was about to win a competition against him for, I think it was making statues, he just blew up both statues. Meanwhile, Dorn's stubbornness and rigid sense of duty, his laser focus and lack of flexible thinking on occasion, made him less inclined towards a playful or friendly rivalry. He viewed his role as the Praetorian with solemnity and dignity, leaving little room in his personality for levity or gamesmanship. His pride in his work thus came across as condescending, especially to Perturabo, who is already overly sensitive to perceived slights. Russ and Gilliman and Jagatai had more of a sense of humor. Yes, even Gilliman. I'm including him in the list. So they were able to approach rivalry with a sense of humor and mutual respect. They could turn it into a bonding experience. Even Fulgrim, whose pride occasionally turned rivalry into arrogance, had enough charisma to make competition feel like admiration on occasion. But Perturabo and Dorn lacked these social dynamics. Their interactions quickly became antagonistic due to their insecurities and their rigid personalities. But then, what opportunities for friendship may have been good options for Dorn? Rogal Dorn, with his unyielding sense of duty, stoicism, and perfectionism, struggled to form close bonds with others. He had a rigid personality and high expectations, which could come off as cold and standoffish. But I feel that certain Primarchs, by virtue of shared values, complementary traits, or the ability to balance his rigidity, might have been good candidates for meaningful friendships. These relationships would have been able to enrich Dorn's emotional life and soften his more isolating personal traits. Gilliman would have been a great option. It's just too bad that they were so geographically isolated from each other. Gilliman shared Dorn's focus on discipline, long-term planning, structure. Both were dedicated to the survival and prosperity of the Imperium, and their visions for its future were pragmatic and methodical. Gilliman's broader perspective on governance might have helped Dorn appreciate the importance of balancing his military role with the civilian, bureaucratic future of the Imperium. Dorn's expertise in fortification might have complemented Gilliman's skills in logistics and social planning, leading to mutual respect. I see a potential dynamic where the two might have bonded over military campaigns and also over collaborative projects, such as designing a big set of fortifications or some such. Gilliman's patience and diplomacy might have tempered Dorn's rigidity of thinking, making a relationship to be built on mutual respect and potentially making Dorn be more open to relationships with others in the future. Vulcan, as is common, would have been a good option for friendship. His warmth and empathy could have served as a counterbalance to Dorn's stoicism, helping him to see the human side of his work. Both of them shared a deep commitment to protecting humanity, albeit with different approaches. Dorn through a defensive mindset where he protected humanity from outside of it, but Vulcan through a compassionate, sacrificial mindset, wherein the salamanders defended humanity alongside them rather than outside of them. Vulcan's humility might have made it easier for Dorn to let down his guard and open up emotionally. Perhaps the two might have been able to collaborate on rebuilding war-torn worlds, with Dorn focusing on his infrastructure, while Vulcan focused on its population. Vulcan's ability to connect with people might have inspired Dorn to develop any sort of understanding and connection with those that he sought to protect, instead of just not making an effort. Ferrus Manus is an interesting choice, because his personality was so similar to that of Dorn. He shared Dorn's perfectionism and both valued discipline, resilience, and the pursuit of excellence. Meanwhile, they also were both kind of aloof. They had a shared idea that you fight and then you move on and you leave the world for the humans to administer. Their shared love of crafting, Ferrus with his technology and Dorn with his fortifications, could have been a strong point of connection. And their shared lack of interest in strong emotional bonding might have paradoxically made them good at doing it with each other. Maybe it would have been nice for them to have a collaborative engineering project or a offense-based competition between them, who can conquer the most worlds, that sort of thing. Ferris's practicality might have resonated with Dorn's methodical mindset, allowing them to work together seamlessly. Both of them had high standards and rigid personalities. This might have thus led to friction if they clashed over differences in approach. But on the other hand, Ferris Manus had already demonstrated a friendship with an unlikely Fulgrim, who was very different in his approach. And as always, Sanguinius would have been a great option for a friend. He was the empathetic idealist of the Primarchs. Sanguinius's charisma and emotional intelligence might have been able to help Dorn connect with his more compassionate and human side. Both of them shared a strong sense of duty and self-sacrifice. Sanguinius's ability to inspire others might have resonated with Dorn's dedication to protecting the Imperium. Sanguinius might have encouraged Dorn to focus on the morale and well-being of those he served, complementing Dorn's focus on discipline and defense. Their friendship might have provided Dorn with a sense of camaraderie and emotional support, helping to alleviate his loneliness. As a bit of a stretch, maybe we could consider Corax. Corax's precision in warfare might have appealed to Dorn's appreciation of achievement. Both of them valued duty and loyalty, and their shared focus on practical solutions might have thus fostered mutual respect, even though their approaches were quite different. And I claim that had Dorn made an effort, he might have been able to turn Perturabo from a rival into an ally and friend. Their rivalry was canonically antagonistic, but that was because of the choices they made. A different dynamic, fostered by collaboration and respect, could have been constructed brick by brick by making different choices. Both of them shared an appreciation of fortification and logistics, and their complementary strengths might have driven each other in friendlier competition to new heights of excellence. They could have worked together on monumental defensive projects, thus fostering admiration for each other's expertise. Perturabo's bitterness might have been alleviated if Dorn had recognized his talents, creating a more cooperative relationship, or if the Emperor had given Perturabo some sort of title and duties to counterbalance Dorn's position as Praetorian. But their competitive natures and differing philosophies on defense and offense might have caused tension. We mentioned before, Dorn was more of an idealist, and Perturabo was more of a pragmatist. I feel that several other Primarchs would have been unlikely to bond with Dorn. The rough and outspoken Fenrisian Leman Russ, lover of a song and an ale. Fulgrim, whose flamboyance and vanity would have clashed with Dorn's stoicism. Conrad Kurs, of course, whose nihilism was anathema to Dorn's sense of order and progress. And Lorgar's fixation on faith and religious devotion was alien to Dorn, who would have seen it as an affront to the Emperor's secular vision, which it was. Overall, the theme for Dorn's potential for friendships would be mutual respect for duty. He would bond best with those who shared his sense that they had an important duty, that they were disciplined enough to live up to that duty, and that it was worthwhile, came with a sense of validation and purpose, and was appreciated by others. Balancing Dorn's rigidity and lack of emotional intelligence with a more empathetic Primarch like Vulcan or Sanguinius might have perhaps helped Dorn to see beyond his stoic exterior and connect with others on a deeper level. And overall, Dorn's appreciation for achievement means that collaborative opportunities, working on shared projects, might have provided Dorn with a way to build friendships through mutual effort and admiration of each other's achievements. Think of it in the sense of parallel play. They're not necessarily working together, they're working near each other. Rogal Dorn's friendships would likely have been built on shared values of duty, discipline, and self-sacrifice, because that's what was important to him. His rigid nature made forming bonds challenging, but there were some Primarchs who offered opportunities for meaningful connections, which might have softened his stoicism and provided him with the camaraderie he desperately needed. Here's the big question, though. Did the Emperor even want Leman Russ or Rogal Dorn to form friendships with their brothers? He counted on Russ, his enforcer, to enforce his directives on the other Primarchs, occasionally killing them. And maybe friendship might have thus led to hesitation when it came to his doing his duty. Dorn, his Praetorian, was kept closer to the Emperor than other Primarchs, and he may not have wanted Dorn to split his focus, almost like he was one of the Custodes. Both of them were given positions of immense trust and authority, thus potentially limiting the Emperor's willingness for them to form deep bonds with their brothers. The Emperor viewed all of the Primarchs as tools to serve specific purposes, and perhaps emotional entanglements would have complicated the purposes of these two. Leman Russ was the Emperor's enforcer, his executioner. We'll talk about him more later, but we got to talk about him a little now, because it rhymes with the expectations for Rogal Dorn as Praetorian. Leman Russ was the Emperor's executioner, the one who would bring recalcitrant Primarchs and legions to heel. His assignment to censure and destroy, if necessary, put him in direct conflict with his brothers on multiple occasions. The burning of Prospero, his assignment to bring Angron to heel, his role in the censuring of the 2nd and 11th Legions show that Russ was expected to act without hesitation, even against his brothers, especially against his brothers. And that carried on even after the Emperor's entombment on the Golden Throne during the Scouring, when the Space Wolves were hunting down traitors throughout the galaxy. Friendship with the other Primarchs might have created moral and emotional conflicts, leading to hesitation or outright refusal to carry out the Emperor's orders. Thus, the Emperor, I feel, deliberately kept Russ at arm's length from his brothers to ensure that he would fulfill his role without emotional entanglements. Russ's sense of loyalty was directed almost entirely at the Emperor, upwards, and at his legion, downwards, with his relationships with his brothers laterally characterized by rivalry, such as with Lionel L. Johnson, or with more distant professional respect. Russ's isolation thus contributed to his reputation as a blunt instrument of the Emperor's will, but it left him without the emotional support he might have needed to navigate the immense burden of his role. His inability to form closer bonds deepened the divides between himself and his other fellow Primarchs. Let's get back to Dorn, the Praetorian. The Emperor expected him to hold to his role as defender of Terra. It placed him closer to the Emperor than most of his brothers. As the architect of the Imperial Palace's defenses, and as the Emperor's trusted lieutenant on the forefront of the Great Crusade, Dorn's focus was on duty, loyalty, and ensuring the security of the Imperium's heart. The Emperor saw Dorn as an extension of his will, akin to the Custodes, tasked with safeguarding Terra and carrying out his own will above all else. And so, friendship with his brother Primarchs was seen as a distraction. It would have split Dorn's focus and created potential conflicts of loyalty. I feel it thus unlikely that the Emperor would have been open to Rogal Dorn having friends. He kept Dorn close, tasked him with working alongside him at the front lines of the Great Crusade, and then later took him with him when he returned to Terra. The deliberate limitation of Dorn's opportunities to form bonds with his brothers can thus be seen as a tactic to isolate him and make him more reliant on the Emperor. Unlike Horus, who was given carte blanche to develop extensive relationships with those who he worked alongside and then later who were his subordinates, Dorn was isolated by his role. Thus, Dorn's stoicism and unyielding focus on duty was reinforced by his lack of close relationships. This made him perhaps a more effective Praetorian, but deepened his rigid thinking and made him less effective as a leader of other Primarchs. He was not a Horus figure to maneuver each other Primarch according to exactly their strengths and limitations. Dorn's rivalry with Perturabo might have been mitigated by more opportunities for collaboration between them, but the Emperor's focus on Dorn's role as being entirely his own, entirely dedicated to the Emperor, thus precluded this possibility. And so we can see the Emperor's emotional distance and his view of the Primarchs contributing to the schism between Dorn and Perturabo. The Emperor treated the Primarchs as tools to fulfill specific roles in the Great Crusade, rather than as sons with emotional needs. For Russ and Dorn, he required them to have emotional distance and a singular focus on duty. He knew that personal bonds could interfere with their ability to fulfill their roles. Russ as his enforcer, and Dorn as his Praetorian. But this meant that he had a lack of effort to foster camaraderie among the Primarchs, and did not care about developing schisms and ill will between them. He had a willingness to encourage rivalry between them on occasion. Thus, he saw emotional ties as secondary to the practical purposes of the Primarchs. But by discouraging or neglecting the development of good relationships between the Primarchs as brothers and possibly friends, the Emperor thus created divisions among the Primarchs, making more emotional vulnerabilities to be preyed upon by the temptations of chaos. For Russ, the lack of deep bonds exacerbated his isolation, thus potentially contributing to his leaving the Imperium after the Horus Heresy. While for Dorn, it may have reinforced his rigidity and inability to adapt to emotional challenges, thus leading him to walk right into the trap at the Iron Cage. Yes, it's true, despite these weaknesses caused by the Emperor isolating them, these two did remain loyal. Yes, he isolated them specifically so that they would be loyal only to the Emperor, but that meant that without the Emperor, they were unmoored and less able to help the Imperium. The Emperor saw emotional connections as liabilities. Meaningful friendships could have provided both Russ and Dorn with much-needed emotional support and perspective, but also would have allowed them to help their other brothers, especially if Dorn had been able to find a friendship with Perturabo that would have helped Perturabo immensely. For Russ, friendship with empathetic Primarchs might have softened Russ's blunt nature, helping him to approach his duties with greater understanding and nuance, and to grasp the human side of him more deeply than the animal side of him. These bonds might have thus created opportunities for Russ to reflect on the consequences of his actions before just acting, thus potentially avoiding the burning of Prospero because his approach would have been tempered. For Dorn, close relationships with Primarchs like Guilliman or Ferrus Manus might have given Dorn additional perspectives on leadership and collaboration, reducing his isolation and rigidity. Such bonds may have perhaps allowed him to be more successful in calling legions back to Terra after the start of the Horus Heresy, because he would have had more of a sense of camaraderie and shared purpose. We can remember that the White Scars almost did not return to Terra when Dorn called them. And so, overall, we can see that the Emperor's failure to encourage friendship and brotherhood among the Primarchs contributed to the divisions and misunderstandings among them, ultimately weakening the Imperium. The rigidity and isolation of the roles of both Russ and Dorn are reflections of the Emperor's own emotionally distant nature, thus making a cycle of unfulfilled emotional needs, missed opportunities for connection, and missed opportunities for Russ and Dorn to help their brothers' emotional needs be met. So, overall, the Emperor did not want these two Primarchs to form friendships with their brothers, as their roles required singular loyalty only to the Emperor and an unyielding focus on duty. But this emotional isolation came at a significant cost, not just for the two of them, but for the group of Primarchs overall. It denied them the support and perspective that they could have received and that they could have provided to others through friendship and brotherhood. By encouraging emotional connections among the Primarchs, the Emperor might have been able to strengthen the bonds between them, creating a more unified and resilient Imperium. That is to say, if the Primarchs were able to help meet each other's emotional needs, they would have been less vulnerable to chaos. Before we get into the Horus Heresy, let us take one more moment to consider Dorn's loyalty. He was a heavily favored tool of the Emperor, though not a beloved son. He had few friends due to his standoffish personality, but he had good relations with allies. He had a clear view of his duty, but perhaps did not love it the way that Jagatai or Fulgrim loved combat. I think his loyalty may not have been as assured as might appear at first glance. Let's explore some potential fault lines of his personality and unmet emotional needs. Rogal Dorn is often viewed as a paragon of loyalty and duty, but he was not flawless. His fault lines are subtle, as Dorn's sense of purpose and unyielding discipline formed a bedrock of resistance to corruption. But they do exist, and understanding them might provide insight into what might have caused even such a stalwart figure to waver, and therefore greater insight into what would have helped one of the traitor Primarchs to stay loyal. Most importantly, Dorn had a need for validation. While Dorn was heavily favored as the Emperor's Praetorian, he lacked the warm personal connection to the Emperor that Horus and Sanguinius enjoyed. His sense of worth came from fulfilling his duty perfectly, publicly, and visibly, and thus receiving validation. But this reliance on external validation left him vulnerable to feelings of inadequacy or bitterness if his efforts were overlooked or criticized. He was much more similar to Perturabo than he ever would have liked to admit. Chaos could have exploited this by presenting him with visions of being undervalued, contrasting his sacrifice and that of his legion with the Emperor's favoritism towards others. Dorn was also inflexible. This rigidity, his stubbornness, was both a strength and weakness. His inability to adapt emotionally and difficulty adapting tactically when faced with unconventional problems might have led to frustration. Perhaps Tzeentch could have tempted him with promises of clarity, or the ability to impose his will upon the galaxy, playing on his desire to resolve disorder with strength. Dorn had few close relationships and seemed to struggle with emotional vulnerability. His interactions were often professional and duty-driven rather than personal. And when he was driven to emotion, it was sometimes great anger, as with Perturabo, when Perturabo questioned the adequacy of the imperial palace, Conrad Kurs, when he revealed his visions of the emperor betraying him, and elsewhere we also see a little bit with Ferrus Manus and Leman Russ. This emotional distance might have left him susceptible to loneliness or self-doubt, perhaps making him vulnerable to a chaos power who offered him companionship or understanding in the guise of a demonic presence. As Praetorian, Dorn carried immense responsibility for the safety of the Imperium. The weight of this duty might have become overwhelming, especially during moments of failure or doubt. Chaos could have exploited this by showing him a vision of a future where his efforts were in vain, offering him a way to escape the burden or to achieve a more certain victory. Despite his stoic exterior, Dorn may have indeed feared failing the Emperor or not living up to the expectations placed on him, a fear of inadequacy. Perhaps a chaos power could have preyed on this by offering him freedom from the fear of failure, a way to embrace inevitability rather than fighting against it. Maybe Nurgle would have been an option. But in all of these, we see the possibility as being very slight, because many of his emotional needs were indeed met. He was validated and recognized for his actions and those of his legion as the Emperor's Praetorian, for example. But there were some unmet emotional needs. He needed recognition beyond duty, perhaps. Dorn was deeply respected, but rarely celebrated in the way that Guilliman and Sanguinius were. His accomplishments were seen as expected of him, rather than extraordinary, among others. Perhaps chaos could have offered him the acknowledgement and gratitude he craved, but never sought openly. Dorn's stoicism may have masked a desire for someone else to truly understand him and the sacrifices he made. Unlike Primarchs who confided in close brothers or mentors, even Conrad Kurs confided in Fulgrim, Dorn seemed to bear his burdens alone. A chaos power might have posed as a confidant, feeding his need for understanding while subtly twisting his perspective. And Dorn's loyalty was tied to his role as a tool to the Emperor, but he did not have fulfillment beyond that function. If he had ever questioned the purpose or meaning of his duty, perhaps this doubt could have become a fissure that chaos could exploit. Ultimately, though, in all of these explorations, we see very slight problems, very small unmet needs. He was, overall, satisfied with his role. He was confident that he was doing his role well, and that was enough for him. Yes, it's possible that he could have been more emotionally healthy and had more validation and understanding from his father or his brothers. But he wasn't lacking so much, like, for example, Perturabo. Rogal Dorn's loyalty to the Emperor and the Imperium was deeply ingrained, but it was not unassailable. He had immense pressures on him from his role. He had unmet emotional needs. He had personal vulnerabilities. These made subtle fault lines that chaos could have exploited. It is just that in canon, they were not exploited. The fact that Dorn resisted the temptations which existed underscores his discipline and devotion. But it is a testament to his character that his loyalty was not simply an unthinking automatic trait. Just like all of the other loyalist Primarchs, his loyalty was a conscious choice which was made despite his vulnerabilities. Now, what can we learn of the character of Dorn from his deeds during the Horus Heresy? Let's first look at the period before the Siege of Terra. The events described in canon highlight his strengths, vulnerabilities, and evolution as a leader in the face of betrayal, deception, and immense responsibility. First, the flight of the Eisenstein. The whole point of the escape of the Eisenstein from the Istvan V betrayal was to warn Terra about Horus's betrayal. And when Garo of the Death Guard tells Dorn that Horus and 8 other legions have betrayed the Imperium, Dorn just doesn't believe it. This is a weakness in his character, but it's been well explored in other people's videos. Now, as the Emperor's Praetorian, Dorn's primary duty was to secure Terra and the Sol system against the traitor advance. This responsibility shaped his actions during the heresy. Dorn's unwavering commitment to his role demonstrates his sense of responsibility and the weight he placed on his position as the Imperium's defender, balancing the need to defend Terra while maintaining Imperial control over other outposts in the Sol system, such as the Pluto early warning system, shows Dorn's ability to think strategically with complex decision-making, even under immense pressure. Alpharius, master of deception and sabotage, was the right choice for Horus to select for the role of going up against Dorn here. Alpharius launched a campaign to destabilize the Sol system and take out the early warning installations at Pluto. This forced Dorn to respond to an unfamiliar type of warfare. Dorn was strong in direct conflict. He and his legion excelled in straightforward, traditional warfare. This clashed with Alpharius's subterfuge and asymmetric and insurgency tactics. The Sol War forced Dorn to adapt to new challenges, exposing both the weaknesses of his rigidity but also his growing capacity to learn and grow and change. Dorn's disdain for the Alpha Legion's methods reflect his preference for honorable, forthright, face-to-face combat. This frustration did occasionally cloud his judgment, as we can see when he did not realize that the Istvan V betrayal was even an option. This made him vulnerable later to Alpharius's psychological warfare. His great success in this early part of the Great Crusade was the Battle of Pluto and his killing of Alpharius. In effect, he was able to force Alpharius to fight him on his own terms, not on Alpharius's terms. The climactic confrontation between Dorn and Alpharius on Pluto is thus a pivotal moment for both characters that reveals much about Dorn in particular. Dorn's relentless pursuit of Alpharius, despite the Alpha Legion's constant interference, paid off in forcing Alpharius to fight him on Dorn's terms. This demonstrates his focus and perseverance. He was very goal-oriented. Dorn ultimately killed Alpharius in single combat, with this victory thus underscoring his martial prowess and his resolve to fulfill his duty, no matter the personal cost. Now, perhaps Dorn had improved his martial prowess and skill at single combat since his near death at the hands of Kurz, or perhaps Alpharius was weaker than Kurz or less suited to that particular type of warfare. Whatever. I'll leave that to the power scaler YouTubes. I'm not interested in that side of things. But then, killing Alpharius may have dealt a psychological blow to the Alpha Legion, but it was an ambiguous victory. It revealed Dorn's potential to act impulsively in the face of provocation. Some accounts suggest that Alpharius may have intended his death to serve as part of a broader plan, thus leaving Dorn uncertain about whether he had truly triumphed. But even so, don't look too much into that. I feel that a victory is a victory is a victory. Now, we can see throughout the Sol War here, Dorn's initial struggles against the Alpha Legion's unconventional warfare, revealing his rigidity, his tendency to rely on established methods. But his gradual ability to adapt to Alpharius' tactics and outmaneuver him to force him into a type of battle that Alpharius and the Alpha Legion were unsuited for, showcases Dorn's ability to learn and evolve and change and grow under pressure. That sentence got away from me. Dorn's belief in the righteousness of his cause gave him strength. It made him perhaps less flexible in dealing with morally ambiguous situations later. But at that point in the Horus Heresy, it was not ambiguous. As Praetorian, Dorn bore the burden of defending the Emperor's vision alone, isolating him from his brother. The Soul War magnified this loneliness, as he could not rely on conventional camaraderie to overcome Alpharius' subterfuge. The constant threats to the Soul system and the immense pressure of his role weighed heavily on Dorn, further hardening his resolve, but also deepening his burden of leadership and deepening his isolation. All throughout the Soul War, Dorn was thinking, where the heck is the Emperor? The Emperor, of course, was dealing with Magnus' bullshit, but we'll get to that later. Each victory, especially the death of Alpharius, reinforced Dorn's belief in his mission, even as it highlighted the moral and strategic compromises he had to make. But then Dorn's straightforward and honorable nature clashed with the reality of the heresy, most notably exploited by the authors in his conversation with Garo of the Death Guard, forcing Dorn to confront the complexities of betrayal, deception, and the darker aspects of war. By realizing that his brothers could turn traitor, he necessarily had to confront the idea that the Emperor's vision was flawed, because why else would they have turned traitor? Dorn's actions during this early part of the heresy stand out when compared to his brothers. The clash between Dorn's directness and Alpharius' deception exemplifies the tension between traditional and unconventional or asymmetric warfare. Like Guilliman, Dorn demonstrated a strategic mind and a commitment to duty. However, Dorn stayed in the Soul system because it was his duty. Guilliman established the Imperium Secundus because he misunderstood his duty. The Soul War highlighted Dorn's ability to endure immense pressure, a trait shared with Perturabo. But then, while Dorn's resolve strengthened his loyalty, Perturabo's experiences deepened his own bitterness and led to his eventual betrayal. Thus, Dorn's deeds during these early parts of the Horus Heresy reveal a character defined by unyielding duty, moral certainty, and the ability to endure immense burdens. The Soul War tested his adaptability, forcing him to confront his own limitations and evolve as a leader. While his victories strengthened his resolve, they also underscored the emotional and strategic complexities of his role as the Emperor's Praetorian. Through these challenges, Dorn's character emerges filled with strength, but also embracing his ability to change and grow. Then we come to the most important parts of his life. Dorn leading the siege of Terra, that is, after the Soul War, but before the final battle aboard the Vengeful Spirit. The siege of Terra represents the culmination of Dorn's virtues and flaws, as the Emperor's Praetorian was pushed to his emotional and physical limits. The period where he was directly in command of the defense of the Imperial Palace reveals the effects of relentless pressure, his evolving understanding of war, and his deepening connection to his duty and those brothers who were present, Sanguinius and Jagatai Khan. As the primary architect of Terra's defenses and leader of its defense while the Emperor was busy dealing with Magnus' bullshit, Dorn bore the crushing responsibility of safeguarding the Imperium's heart, and Dorn's belief in his role as Terra's defender never wavered. Even in the face of overwhelming odds, with 8 legions against his 3, because the word bearers mostly weren't present, He continued to focus on his duty, inspiring his allies with his fortitude. The enormity of his task isolated Dorn from his brothers and subordinates. While he worked alongside Sanguinius and Jagatai and Malcador, his unique burden set him apart, making him even more emotionally distant than before. The siege forced Dorn to adapt his traditionally rigid mindset to an unpredictable and chaotic situation. While his initial approach to Terra's defenses focused on rigid thinking about fortification and perfection of the defensive lines, the constant pressure from Perturabo's siege expertise and the massed forces of the traitors forced Dorn to compromise and prioritize, balancing his idealism with the pragmatic reality on the ground. Dorn's collaboration with the Blood Angels and White Scars, not so much the Custodes, they were with the Emperor in the Webway, shows his ability to rely on others and distribute responsibilities. This represents a substantial shift from his earlier, more solitary approach. Dorn's relationships during the siege show his evolving strengths. Notably with Sanguinius, the angelic Primarch offered Dorn emotional support and a complementary perspective. While Sanguinius inspired hope, Dorn embodied resilience, creating a dynamic that helped sustain the defenders' morale. Malcador's pragmatic wisdom and honestly abrasive personality clashed with Dorn's moral certainties, forcing Dorn to confront uncomfortable truths about the war and the sacrifices required. Their partnership was strained, but it was vital for Terra's survival. The siege took an immense toll on Dorn, exposing cracks in his stoic demeanor. Dorn felt personally responsible for every casualty and every failure, every defeat, as Perturabo's immense strategic genius and seemingly limitless numbers ground down the loyalists. Dorn internalized the deaths of countless Imperial army soldiers and a great number of civilians across Terra. The constant barrage of traitor forces and the betrayal of his brothers fueled Dorn's anger. This occasionally manifested in harsh interactions with some of his allies, reflecting his internal struggles. As the traitors breached Terra's various rings of defenses, and the traitors came right up to the Eternity Gate, and the Emperor was missing, dealing with the Webway bullshit. Dorn was grappling with doubts, and he had to never allow them to undermine his resolve and never allow them to be visible. We can see some key events in the canon. Dorn's defense of the Saturnine Wall against the attack by Fulgrim and Abaddon showcased his tactical brilliance and ability to inspire his forces. The defense of the Eternity Gate, his decision to entrust others with key defensive points, in that case Sanguinius, highlights his growing willingness to share responsibility. By the time that Dorn accompanied Sanguinius and the Emperor to the Vengeful Spirit, Dorn had evolved significantly. He had gone from strict stoicism to emotional depth. The siege forced Dorn to confront his guilt and grief and rage and desperation, and remain stoic outwardly. Dorn's adaptability grew during the siege, as he prioritized survival and victory over ideological perfection. He didn't need to be the best. He knew that Perturabo was better than he was. He just needed to last long enough for reinforcements to get there. And though still distant, Dorn's relationships with his brothers showed a growing recognition of the importance of collaboration and shared burden. Dorn's resilience complemented Sanguinius's inspirational leadership. Where Sanguinius symbolized hope, Dorn embodied the unyielding strength needed to make that hope a reality. By working together at the defense of the Imperial Palace, the defenders had the greatest morale they possibly could have. No matter what all of the other Primarchs were doing anywhere else in the galaxy, it just came down to Jagatai Khan slowing the reinforcements and supplies of the traitors, Sanguinius inspiring hope and providing his martial skill, and Dorn providing the strategic genius to try to counter Perturabo's strategies. In all of this, the Siege of Terra brings out both Dorn's strengths and his vulnerabilities, showing him as a deeply human figure grappling with immense responsibility and loss, even viewed through the limited lens of the mediocre writing of many of the Horus Heresy novels. Through these trials, Dorn emerged as a symbol of resilience and duty, embodying the Imperium's strength even in its darkest hour. Now, we've already examined Sanguinius's view that his death fighting aboard the Vengeful Spirit was foreordained and unavoidable, and his choice to go anyway. Let's now look to Dorn's decision to go aboard the Vengeful Spirit. The Siege of Terra was slowly being won by the traitors. Dorn confided in top commanders that they faced certain defeat if the situation did not change. Nobody knows whether the Dark Angels and Space Wolves, or in later canon, Ultramarines, will arrive in time to decisively turn the tide. Horus decides to gamble and dare the Emperor to face him personally. What might have influenced Dorn's emotional state at this point? Hope that they might snatch victory from the jaws of defeat? Desperation? Confidence that Horus was making a mistake? Maybe uncertainty about whether his proper place was to board with his brother and his father, or to stay behind and hold the line. We already know from canon that Dorn had already planned a fallback option: shove the Emperor onto the phalanx, run the traitor gauntlet, escape the Sol system. But then he more or less gave up on that plan and just went to the Vengeful Spirit. And thus, Dorn's decision to board the Vengeful Spirit alongside the Emperor and Sanguinius is a moment that speaks to Dorn's sense of duty, his emotional state, and the immense pressures on him. This decision can't be viewed in isolation, but must be understood within the context of the broader Siege of Terra. By the time Horus lowered the shields of the Vengeful Spirit, thus allowing a teleport strike, the defenders of Terra were nearing collapse. The Imperial forces were exhausted, overwhelmed, and on the brink of annihilation. Dorn was acutely aware of this, and he had confided in his commanders that their position was untenable. Dorn's rigid sense of duty would have thus driven him to find any opportunity to turn the tide. Horus's gambit might have seemed like a faint glimmer of hope, but Dorn was definitely able to recognize the enormous risks involved. Dorn viewed Horus lowering the shields as an opportunity, but he was still kind of iffy about it. The chance to strike directly at the architect of the rebellion was irresistible to him, even though it was a trap. And we see this play out again later with the Iron Cage. He had to fight Perturabo at the Iron Cage, even though he knew it was a trap. The decision was thus tinged with hope that they could end the war by killing Horus, and desperation, worried that they might have no other visible path to victory. The Emperor's decision to personally confront Horus, the first time he had left the webway, in order to take to the field himself, since Magnus did his webway bullshit. This is the first time that Dorn had spent any substantial amount of time with the Emperor in like 7 years. This heavily influenced Dorn's state of mind. Horus lowers the shields, and the Emperor, who rarely acted with such immediacy, springs into action, clearly demonstrating that the moment was critical. For Dorn, the Emperor's choice to thus board the Vengeful Spirit, temporarily abandoning whatever else he was doing, which I don't think Dorn knew about, underscored the necessity of the action. Dorn did allow himself to question whether it was the right course, but he knew that his role was to support the Emperor's decision, even if it conflicted with his own tactical instincts. Dorn may have interpreted Horus lowering the shields as overconfidence or tactical error. He might have known that Horus was underestimating the Imperial force's ability to strike back, and he certainly knew that Perturabo had been the real brains behind behind the heresy for like a couple of years by that point. But Dorn's cautious nature would have thus tempered this confidence with the knowledge of Horus's immense challenge. Dorn's role was Praetorian of Terra. He was the strategist in charge of the entire defense of the Imperial Palace. Thus, that made him question whether his place was aboard the Vengeful Spirit or remaining behind to command the defense. His identity was deeply tied to protecting the Emperor's domain, and abandoning the battlefield could have felt like a betrayal of that duty. But at the same time, he was the Praetorian. His duty was to be with the Emperor. He had to protect the Emperor, not just the palace. And thus, his loyalty to the Emperor and his recognition of the unique stakes involved overrode his doubts. He saw this as the moment when his duty to the Emperor himself outweighed his duty to the planet and the people on it. At this point, Dorn was overwhelmed. The unrelenting pressure of the siege, the deaths of countless defenders, and the betrayal of his brothers had taken an enormous toll on Dorn's stoic facade. He carried immense guilt for the lives lost under his command, and for not being Perturabo's equal in strategy. But despite this, Dorn's discipline and resolve kept him focused on the task at hand. He buried his doubts and fears and acted decisively in the Emperor's service. Dorn's personality and methods thrived on preparation and order, but the siege's unpredictability forced him into a reactive position. The chance to board the Vengeful Spirit was a relief, a moment where he could take direct action. He knew full well, especially from the Pluto battle, that the way to victory was not to react to your opponent's moves. You don't fight the battle your enemy chooses. You make moves of your own. Make him react to you. Dorn was prepared to give his life if it meant ending the war and protecting the Emperor, potentially by killing Horus or potentially by helping the Emperor to kill Horus. And he was right there, shoulder to shoulder with Sanguinius. Just like Sanguinius, Dorn understood the stakes and was willing to risk everything for the Emperor and humanity. But Sanguinius saw his death as foreordained. Dorn had no such likelihood, not for himself, and honestly, he didn't really believe in the whole prophecy thing for Sanguinius, from what I can tell from the books. Sanguinius brought hope and inspiration to this mission, just like the rest of the Siege of Terra, whereas Dorn embodied stoic resilience. These two brothers complemented each other all through the siege. Sanguinius's sacrifice thus paved the way for Dorn and the Emperor to act. The angelic Primarch embodied hope and courage that Dorn himself struggled to express emotionally. Maybe Dorn went to the Vengeful Spirit in the hopes of preventing Sanguinius's death. The death of Sanguinius profoundly affected Dorn, deepening Dorn's sense of isolation and loss. and also stealing his resolve to see the Emperor's vision fulfilled. Dorn's decision to board the vengeful spirit thus reflects his unwavering loyalty, his willingness to shoulder impossible burdens, and his ability to act decisively under pressure. While he experienced doubts and conflicting emotions, his dedication to his duty and his belief in the Emperor's vision ultimately drove him forward. This moment thus encapsulates Dorn's character as a figure of resilience, sacrifice, and unyielding devotion, even in the face of uncertainty and despair. The Emperor is dead. Sanguinius and Ferrus Manus are dead. The dream of the Imperial truth is dead. So many worlds, hundreds of thousands of Marines, billions upon billions of humans have all died for the madness of Horus and the bitterness of Dorn's dark mirror, Perturabo. And there he is, in a giant, planets-wide fortress with his legion, Perturabo, waiting for Dorn. Dorn was obviously going to attack the Iron Cage with the full strength of his remaining sons, no matter what. There is no way that Dorn could have possibly made a different choice. The big question about the Iron Cage, thus, is this: was Dorn seeking his own death in combat? Had he lost hope and just wanted to end? The Iron Cage is thus the second most compelling moment in Dorn's story, right behind finding the dead Emperor, precisely because of the ambiguity of his motivations. It's clear that the attack on the Iron Warrior's fortress worlds was not a strategic decision. It was a deeply emotional decision, driven by the weight of the Horus heresy and its aftermath. I wonder whether he sought death or redemption or some combination of both. I think we gotta look at his state of mind and his emotional wounds to get an idea of this. The loss of the Emperor, Sanguinius, Ferrus Manus, countless others, all weighed heavily on Dorn. As the Emperor's Praetorian, Dorn felt a profound sense of failure for not being able to protect his father or his brother Sanguinius or Terra. He carried survivor's guilt, believing that his own survival was unjust, while others, more deserving, had perished. The dream of the Imperial truth was shattered by the heresy. Dorn had devoted his life to building and defending the Emperor's vision, only to see it crumble in the fires of civil war. This disillusionment thus left Dorn questioning the value of everything he had fought for. If the dream was dead, what purpose remained? Perturabo, his bitter rival, the de facto leader of the heresy for the last couple of years of it, was one of the foremost champions of chaos. His treachery a direct insult to everything Dorn had believed in, and Perturabo had proved himself the strategic superior of Dorn throughout the Siege of Terra, slowly grinding down the defenders inevitably towards defeat. The chance to confront Perturabo, maybe in personal combat, was thus deeply personal, and Dorn viewed it as an opportunity to settle accounts. But was he looking to die or to redeem himself? I feel that the scale of the battle is evidence towards Dorn seeking death in the Iron Cage. The Iron Cage was a trap. Dorn knew it, and he brought the full weight of his legion into the attack anyway. They were thrown into a grueling attritional siege, fighting on terrain designed by Perturabo to break them. Dorn's decision to commit his legion wholesale to such a battle suggests that he was willing to risk everything, even when the odds were stacked against him. Dorn's unyielding personality and inability to process grief may have thus been driving him towards self-destruction. The iron cage may have been his way of seeking an honorable death to assuage his survivor's guilt. By dying in battle against his greatest rival, he would have fulfilled his role as a warrior one last time, and proven himself to his memory of Sanguinius. The Imperial Fists suffered catastrophic losses. If I understand the numbers right from canon, they lost something like 40,000 Marines before being rescued by the Ultramarines. Dorn's willingness to accept such losses suggests that he may have viewed the Legion's sacrifice as a form of penance. Dorn's identity was tied to his role as the Emperor's Praetorian, though. Maybe he was looking to prove himself. This is evidence towards his seeking redemption rather than death. The iron cage may have been his way of proving to himself and others that he still had value, that he could still deliver vengeance for the Emperor and strike a blow against chaos. The rivalry between Dorn and Perturabo was deeply personal. The attack on the iron cage was not just about vengeance. It was about confronting and overcoming his dark mirror. He may have thus believed that defeating Perturabo, who was not yet a daemon, he could have been killed permanently, would thus validate his choices and redeem his legion's honor. Even in despair, Dorn's loyalty to the Emperor endured. Perhaps he was looking to honor the Emperor's sacrifice by being willing to make his own sacrifice to strike at the traitors. The beauty of the iron cage in canon thus lies in its ambiguity. Dorn's actions can be read as a tragic expression of his grief, guilt, and need for purpose. He was a deeply conflicted figure, torn between his duty, his emotions, and the weight of the heresy's aftermath. Dorn's decision is thus a mirror of the broader tragedy of the Horus heresy itself. It was high drama and personal stakes, where the lines between heroism and self-destruction blurred. Whether he sought death, redemption, or both, the Iron Cage was a crucible that reforged the Imperial Fists from a legion into the founding chapters, notably the Black Templars, Crimson Fists, and the Imperial Fists chapter. Yet, with all the death and destruction, after the betrayals that cut so deep, and the losses that cut deeper, Dorn is victorious. The Horus heresy ends with a Pyrrhic victory for the Imperium. The Emperor still kept alive, in a sense, on the Golden Throne, while Horus is defeated forever. The Iron Cage ends with a Pyrrhic victory for the Imperium, breaking the Iron Warriors' Legion never again to reunite their scattered warbands, and denying Perturabo his desired trophy of Dorn's death. After everything, the legacy of Rogal Dorn is that he did his duty and accomplished 2 Pyrrhic victories where anyone else could have found only defeat. Where does that leave him emotionally at the latter part of his life, before he later died in combat against the same foe of chaos during one of the Black Crusades? Despite his Pyrrhic victories, despite him being the only one who could have found any form of victory, the emotional toll of the Horus heresy and the Iron Cage left Dorn a broken man in many respects. Yet his unyielding commitment to duty persisted, shaping his actions and leaving an enduring legacy within the Imperium. Dorn's emotional state in the post-heresy, post-scouring era reflects his complex character. Dorn carried profound grief for the deaths of the Emperor and his brothers, countless others lost in the heresy. Despite his stoic nature, those losses weighed heavily on him, especially the Emperor's sacrifice, which he saw as his personal failure as the Praetorian. The Iron Cage then compounded this grief. The devastation suffered by his legion from his own choice was not just a military loss, it was an emotional scar. He saw the consequences of his own choices writ large in the deaths of so many of his sons. Dorn's response to these losses was characteristic of his nature. He redoubled his focus on duty. He directed parts of the rebuilding of the Imperium and acceded to the Codex Astartes, transforming the imperial fists into chapters. In these methods, supporting Guilliman's efforts to keep the Imperium going. His relentless commitment to work thus suggests that Dorn channeled his grief into action, using duty as a way to suppress or avoid his own emotional pain. By this stage, though, Dorn recognized the futility of his efforts. The dream of the imperial truth was gone, replaced by the grim reality of a fractured galaxy ruled by a totalitarian state using superstition and fear. The realization that the Emperor's vision had failed forever was a bitter pill to swallow. His naturally standoffish personality thus further isolated him emotionally. He had few close relationships even before the heresy, and now a bunch of his brothers were dead or traitors, so he found himself increasingly distant from those remaining. What sets Dorn apart is that despite all this, he did not break. He faced more responsibility than any other Primarch up until Guilliman took command of the Imperium, but we'll get to Guilliman later. Dorn's enduring commitment to his duty and to the Imperium demonstrates a strength of character that transcends his own personal suffering. But Dorn's legacy was that he found for the Imperium 2 Pyrrhic victories, coming at tremendous cost. This may seem to the audience like a bitter legacy, but it underscores his role as a figure of endurance and sacrifice. Dorn upheld the Emperor's vision as best he could, preserving what was left of the Imperium twice, even when all seemed lost. And his life is a reminder of the cost of unyielding duty. Dorn's willingness to sacrifice everything to gain some sort of victory highlights the line between heroism and tragedy. For the Imperial Fists, Dorn's legacy is one of unrelenting perseverance, inspiring his sons to continue fighting no matter the odds. But that's not always a good thing. Sometimes the path to victory is to retreat and then counterattack. I've got a book here, Double Eagle. That's like the big plot of the novel Double Eagle. And so then, for the third time, Dorn faced a similar situation. Dorn fought aboard the Chaos despoiler-class battleship Sword of Sacrilege, words are hard, leading a desperate attack on its bridge in order to try to blunt one of the early Black Crusades of Abaddon the Despoiler. The only trace of the missing Primarch, believed to have been recovered by the Imperial Fist's subsequent search, was a single armored fist of his. They've since scrimshawed his bones. It's weird. Dorn's death during a boarding action against Chaos during a Black Crusade encapsulates his character. He died as he lived, fighting to protect the Imperium, giving everything to fulfill his duty, and suffering horrible loss, which was only barely justified by the victory. While his life was defined by loss and sacrifice, his death thus allowed him to escape the endless cycle of Pyrrhic victories. Giving his life in battle, Dorn may have thus found a form of redemption, proving to himself that he did everything possible for the Imperium. Though his death thus marked the end of his personal journey, it also ensured that his legacy would live on through the imperial fists and their successors. His sons could continue his work, carrying his resilience and determination into the future. I feel that Dorn would be the worst choice, therefore, for Games Workshop to revive, like what they've done with Gilliman and Lionel Johnson. As of the time of this recording, Leman Russ is still missing and Jagatai Khan is still missing. In his final years, Dorn was a deeply burdened man. The scars of the heresy and the Iron Cage left him emotionally wounded, but his unwavering sense of duty ensured that he remained a stalwart defender of the Imperium until his death. Dorn's legacy is a testament to the power of endurance and the cost of unrelenting sacrifice, but it's also a testament to the failure of stubbornly continuing to do the same thing rather than changing tactics. Had he evacuated the Emperor from Terra on the Phalanx to counterattack, joining up with the reinforcements of the Space Wolves and Dark Angels and maybe Ultramarines, maybe they could have defeated Horus without the Emperor's death. Who knows? More importantly, was Dorn capable of recognizing that he may have been the only one capable of gaining even a Pyrrhic victory for the Imperium on Terra? Was he able to recognize that he himself was the reason that Perturabo did not break the fortifications wide open? Did he know that he was the reason why they held on long enough for the imminent arrival of reinforcements to force Horus's hand? Or was Dorn able to see only his failure to live up to his own highest expectations? I find these questions to be so intriguing because it looks at the dichotomy of his personality, a relentless perfectionist defining himself by his duty, and also someone burdened by his inability to reach his own impossibly high standards. Could Dorn recognize his successes and achievements? Yeah, he was intellectually aware of his pivotal role in the siege. As the Imperial Praetorian, he was entrusted with the most crucial responsibility of the war, defending Terra, the heart of the Imperium. Dorn's mastery of fortifications and his leadership prevented Perturabo and Horus from breaching the Imperial Palace as quickly as they had hoped. Yes, he knew that they were doomed to defeat, but his strategy and foresight turned the traitors' overwhelming numbers and resources into a grinding war of attrition. He was able to prevent, for example, a lightning strike by Fulgrim at Saturnine, the Saturnine Wall, in the novel Saturnine, from ending the war quickly by breaking open the walls. Thus, by holding out long enough, Dorn indirectly forced Horus to engage in his last gambit, lowering the shields of the vengeful spirit to try to bring the Emperor to personal battle. Without this gamble, the Imperium might have been overwhelmed entirely, but had they not lasted long enough for reinforcements to come near, they might have just breached the inner sanctum and gone in to kill the Emperor on Terra, Horus being safe aboard his flagship. Dorn's presence as a stoic and unwavering leader helped maintain the morale of both his legion and of Terra's defenders. His authority and resilience held the defenders together in the face of despair. Dorn was a deeply logical, intelligent individual and understood all of these facts. He didn't have all the facts about reinforcements, but he knew that reinforcement was only possible if they had enough time. But his emotional response to these successes was more complex. Dorn's personality made him his own harshest critic. He was fixated on failure. He held himself to impossibly high standards, measuring his own worth not by what he achieved, but by what he failed to accomplish. Because of that, this perspective, this warped feature of his personality, overshadowed any recognition of his own triumphs. Despite his efforts as the Praetorian, they were split from each other when they teleported to the Vengeful Spirit, and the Emperor was gravely wounded by Horus, leaving him entombed on the Golden Throne. Dorn viewed this as a personal failure, the personal failure, because protecting the Emperor was his ultimate duty, just like the Custodes. Dorn carried guilt over Sanguinius's death as well, feeling that he should have been at his brother's side, or that he should not have devised a strategy that placed Sanguinius into such a sacrificial role. And so the siege was won, but at an unimaginable cost. Millions of defenders were killed, potentially billions of civilians dead. The imperial palace was in ruins. The emperor was in a state of half-life, and much of the Imperium was left in chaos and disorder. Dorn struggled to view such a costly outcome as any form of victory. Thus, we can see that Dorn, from everything we know about his character from canon, failed to see himself for his own achievements. He was unable to see that he was uniquely suited to achieving even a Pyrrhic victory at Terra. Dorn may have viewed the arrival of the Dark Angels and Space Wolves as the turning point, rather than his own efforts. His self-critical nature may have prevented him from acknowledging to himself that without him, those reinforcements would have arrived to find Terra already defeated. Dorn's focus on perfection blinded him to the value of imperfect victories. To him, anything less than total success, saving the Emperor and defending Terra and defending the Imperium, defeating all the traitors without incurring immense loss, was failure. And Dorn's rivalry with Perturabo intensified his focus on what he could not achieve. Perturabo had breached ring after ring of outer defenses inexorably, inevitably, and Dorn saw this as confirmation of his own inadequacy, rather than seeing the slow pace of those victories as evidence of his own success, and rather than seeing those traitor victories as evidence of the traitor's overwhelming numerical superiority. Dorn's brilliance as commander and his unshakable duty were instrumental in saving the Imperium at Terra, but his inability to fully acknowledge these achievements shows us the tragedy of his character. He was not blind to his successes, but was so consumed by his failures and his imperfections and his sense of responsibility that he could not allow himself to take solace in even his greatest accomplishments. Ultimately, Dorn did not see himself as a hero or savior, but as a flawed person who fell short of the ideals he set for himself. And this perspective defined and tormented him. And also it is quite, unfortunately, familiar to many of us in the audience. How might Rogal Dorn, had he lived, been able to contribute to the Imperium's domestic administration and governance? I feel that Rogal Dorn, like most of the Primarchs, could have contributed substantially to the Imperium's domestic government. He specifically would have focused on defense, organization, and ensuring stability across its territories. His rigid and uncompromising personality would not have made him an ideal figure for diplomacy or overall command of the Imperium, such as Guilliman as Imperial Regent. But his strengths in planning, logistics, and discipline would have been invaluable for maintaining the Imperium's infrastructure and for protecting its people. Dorn's expertise in fortification, strategy, and defensive warfare would have made him an ideal architect of planetary defense systems, ensuring that worlds were well protected from Xenos threats, chaos incursions, and internal rebellions. He could have created standardized defense templates for hive cities, forge worlds, orbital defenses, and off-planet deep space installations, ensuring consistency and reliability across the Imperium. Dorn's focus on preparedness would have thus minimized vulnerabilities and ensured that Imperial worlds would be resistant to prolonged sieges. Establishing fortress networks on strategically important planets, effectively integrating orbital defense systems, planetary shields, and interconnected planetary defense and system defense force assets, training planetary governors and defense forces in siege tactics and defensive warfare, all of that together would have thus enhanced the ability of each world in the Imperium to resist external threats, giving them more time for the Imperial Guard and Imperial Navy to arrive with reinforcements when they faced a threat that they were unable to deal with themselves. Dorn's methodical approach to governance would have been well suited to standardizing the Imperium's administrative systems, reducing inefficiencies and creating a cohesive framework for planetary administration. He would not have been the best at this. He wasn't on that side of civilian administration, and he specifically stayed away from conquering worlds to then himself govern during the Great Crusade. But he would have had place to help. His sense of duty and discipline would have been especially good for emphasizing accountability and effectiveness among planetary governors and bureaucrats, rather than having their power be mostly dependent on political maneuvering. Drafting clear guidelines for resource allocation, military recruitment, and interplanetary trade might have been able to ensure that all sectors of the Imperium functioned cohesively. He could have overseen the creation of a codified system for planetary governance, such as manuals and training for crisis management and long-term planning. Perhaps Rogal Dorn would have been good at helping to rebuild war-torn worlds, especially in the wake of the Iron Cage. Dorn's focus on endurance and resilience might have been applied to reconstructing and stabilizing worlds which had been devastated by a war, and after the Horus Heresy and the Scouring, there were sure a lot of them. His ability to design fortifications could have extended to rebuilding infrastructure, ensuring that it was both durable and practical for future generations. Perhaps he may have been good for leading efforts to rebuild devastated regions with fortified settlements, sustainable supply lines, and resilient agriculture and trade systems. Maybe he would have been good for implementing long-term plans to restore economic and social stability on war-torn planets. Though, it seems obvious to me that Guilliman would have been the better choice for that particular task. Perhaps crisis management and emergency preparedness would have suited his skill set. Dorn's logical, pragmatic nature and skill with logistics would have made him an effective leader in managing crises, such as natural disasters or planetary rebellions. His ability to remain calm under pressure and develop methodical solutions would have been excellent for him then training others, such as planetary governors, to do likewise, thus being invaluable in ensuring the Imperium's survival during periods of crisis. He might have been able to establish systems for the organization and use of rapid response teams, protocols for planetary emergencies, ensuring immediate interstellar action to bring resources where they were needed to mitigate crises. He might have designed centralized hubs for communication and coordination, allowing for swift deployment of resources and reinforcements. Dorn's high standards and belief in discipline would have made him an excellent mentor for planetary governors and military leaders. His emphasis on self-sacrifice and duty could have inspired a new generation of leaders who prioritized the welfare of the Imperium over personal ambition. He might have been instrumental in teaching at leadership academies focused on governance, logistics, and both military and organizational strategy, ensuring that those in power were prepared for their roles. He might have personally overseen the development of promising leaders, instilling them with the values of loyalty and responsibility. Dorn's meticulous nature and long-term vision might have made him a reliable steward of the Imperium's infrastructure, ensuring that it remained functional and secure, rather than slowly decaying under the limited administrations of the Mechanicus. His understanding of logistical networks would have been critical in maintaining warp routes and supply chains across interstellar distances. Perhaps he might have inspected or reinforced the Imperium's infrastructure in order to prevent failures or vulnerabilities. Maybe he might have established systems for routine maintenance and upgrades, ensuring that infrastructure remained reliable for millennia, rather than being left to the theological, ceremonial ministrations of the Mechanicum. Overall, when we compare Dorn's potential for domestic, non-military governance with Guilliman, we can see that Guilliman would excel at large-scale government and societal planning, focused on building a stable and efficient civilization, whereas Dorn would have prioritized making sure that everything was defended and maintained to his standards. Dorn versus Perturabo is an interesting one here, just as it is militarily. Both of them were masters of logistics, but Dorn's approach would have been more focused on resilience and maintaining what was already there, whereas Perturabo's methods often emphasized efficiency and expansion. Also, Dorn's leadership would have been less likely to alienate his subordinates, so there's that. Vulcan's contributions to domestic governance, which we talked about already, would have likely focused on making sure that the welfare of the imperial citizenry was taken care of, while Dorn would have emphasized every individual's duty and the need for discipline to maintain the integrity of the Imperium as a whole. There are challenges, of course, to Dorn having a role in government. Dorn's inflexibility and uncompromising nature might have made him resistant to adapting his methods to local conditions, thus potentially creating friction with planetary governors and leaders. His stoic demeanor and focus on duty might have led him to overlook the human element of governance, prioritizing efficiency over morale. And Dorn's obsession with fortification might have led to an imbalance in resource allocation, prioritizing defense and maintenance of what was already there over expansion and development of what has not yet been achieved. We can thus see some thematic failings of the post-heresy Imperium linked to Dorn's absence by looking at both his military contributions, thematic and symbolism, and also his potential for domestic growth. Without Dorn's oversight, many imperial worlds lack adequate fortifications, leaving them vulnerable to invasions and internal unrest. Dorn's ability to impose discipline and standardization could have provided the Imperium with a more cohesive administrative structure. In his absence, the Imperium's bureaucracy is fractured and inefficient due to both practical reasons from his absence and also the metaphorical symbolic importance of his death. Dorn's long-term vision and emphasis on resilience are missing from the Imperium's decision-making, leading to a frequent reliance on short-term solutions which exacerbate problems over time. We see this with, for example, Forge worlds wrecking the environment of the world, thus making it cost more and more to defend their own cities and factories from the outside elements. Air on Earth right now is free, but if you turned Earth into a new Venus, air would cost a lot to make breathable. Generally, with the idea of the Fisher King, Rogal Dorn represents the ideals of unyielding order, security, and discipline, and his absence is reflected in the flaws and inefficiencies of several institutions related to those. The Adeptus Arbites is not only related to Conrad Kurz, I feel it's also related to Rogal Dorn. We see some parallels to Dorn in their failures. The Adeptus Arbites embodies Dorn's values of order, discipline, and unyielding enforcement of rules and keeping people to high expectations. And like Dorn, they operate with a singular focus on ensuring the stability of the Imperium, no matter the cost. Dorn's stoic and uncompromising nature is mirrored in the Arbites' rigid adherence to the law, but his absence means that they show more of his negative sides than his positive side. They prioritize order over fairness or compassion. And without Dorn as a metaphorical link, the Arbites have become increasingly harsh and authoritarian, working to maintain control rather than inspiring loyalty and cooperation. The inflexible nature of the institution of the Adeptus Arbites mirrors Dorn's worst aspects, his rigidity, and his tendency to fly off the handle with senseless anger when he snaps because he doesn't bend. Similarly, the Arbites suppress dissent, thus causing alienation of the population they're meant to protect. Various imperial fortress worlds and defense systems. In one of these books about the Gaunt's Ghosts, they have the fortress world of Jago. That's the sort of thing I'm talking about. Dorn's legacy as the master of fortification is deeply reflected in the Imperium's reliance on fortress worlds and defensive networks to protect key sectors, and his absence leads to their weakness. His perfectionism and focus shaped the design of these systems, ensuring their durability and their ability to withstand even the most overwhelming attacks. But in the absence of Dorn's vision, the Imperium's fortifications lack coordination and long-term strategic planning. Resources are wasted on defenses which are poorly designed or inadequately maintained, and the overemphasis on static defenses mirrors the Imperium's broader stagnation, focusing on preserving what exists rather than innovating or adapting to new threats. Dorn's methodical and disciplined approach to government is reflected in the administratum's efforts to maintain order and efficiency across the Imperium's vast territories. And his death is thus reflected metaphorically in their failures and their inefficiencies. Like Dorn, the administratum is defined by its ability to endure immense pressure and perform its duties despite overwhelming challenges. But without Dorn's oversight, in his absence and likely death, the administratum has devolved into a bloated and inefficient bureaucracy, prioritizing tradition, ritual, and the maintenance of lists which don't reflect reality over practicality and adaptability. The institution's inability to innovate or respond to crises effectively reflects Dorn's worst tendencies towards inflexibility and over-reliance on rigid thinking. With Dorn absent, they thus reflect his worst impulses and lack his best. The segmentum solar, especially the solar fleet of the Imperial Navy, and the defense of Terra, is obviously linked to Dorn. Dorn's role when he was alive as the Praetorian, the defender of Terra, ties him directly to the Imperium's focus on defending the segmentum solar and maintaining the sanctity of the throne world. After his death, we see those efforts decay into seeming irrelevance and ineffectiveness, thus leading Terra to be directly threatened by the War Moon during the Orc War of the Beast. His influence is evident in the layers of fortifications surrounding Terra and the Sol system, a testament to his strategic genius and foresight. But without Dorn's leadership, the defense of Terra thus became more ceremonial than practical. They did not evolve to address emerging threats, and thus they were unprepared for the beast's attack. The stagnation of Terra's defensive systems thus mirrors the broader decline of the Imperium's ability to innovate and adapt. Thus, with the idea of the Fisher King, Dorn's absence represents a wound to the Imperium's stability, cohesion, and ability to plan for the future. His unyielding dedication to defense and order is reflected in institutions in the Imperium from his inspiration and memory, but in his absence, these institutions have been metaphorically tainted, thus becoming rigid, oppressive, and prone to stagnation. These institutions we've spoken about carry Dorn's ideals in form, but not in spirit. They perpetuate some of his strengths through maintaining his memory, but they carry forward his flaws. The Imperium's inability to adapt or innovate, coupled with its reliance on fear and oppression to maintain control, reflects the deeper wounds left by Dorn's death. The Imperium has some of his strength, yes, but it has an exaggerated amount of his weaknesses and flaws. What other matters could we discuss with regards to Rogal Dorn? Well, there's a bunch of them. Dorn is often seen as stern, loyal, and a military paragon, but there's more nuance worth exploring. Dorn believed in duty and loyalty to the point of emotional repression. What more did he need emotionally, besides what we talked about already? Who, if anyone, would have been best suited to meet those needs? Did he have any particularly close relationships besides the limited relationships we've already spoken about? How did Valdor think about him? What about Malcador? Dorn viewed the Emperor through the view of a sacred mission. He was arguably the most loyal of the Primarchs. But did this intense loyalty come at the cost of self-understanding or flexibility? Did Dorn ever question the Emperor in private, in his own mind? If he did not, was that a weakness? Dorn's genius was in fortification, but how does this reflect his inner world? Yes, his legion was used on offensive missions, that's true, but they excelled in defense. Did he over-prepare for static threats at the cost of understanding more insidious dangers like chaos or gene stealers? What about his own emotional landscape? Did he protect his self-image at the cost of expanding his own mind? What about the reliance on the phalanx, an ancient archaeotech vessel which he did not construct? Dorn was shattered by Horus's betrayal. Perhaps we might look at the psychological toll of being blindsided, despite being the wall of the Imperium, who is supposed to stand against all threats. Was his fury at the traitor legions born just from anger at their betrayal, or maybe self-hatred due to his failure to see it coming? How much did he blame himself at the start of the heresy? Does this help us examine his reaction to Garo at learning of the heresy and initially suffering from denial? Dorn's relationship with Perturabo is essential. It's a mirror of his own mind, but twisted into resentment. But what about Kurz? When he flew off the handle and berated Kurz for Kurz's visions of the future in which he was betrayed by the Emperor, did he fly off the handle so much because that hit close to home? Did he worry that the Emperor would betray him? What about his other brothers? Was he distant from his more idealistic brothers like Sanguinius or Vulcan? Did he resent Guilliman's free reign and independence, whereas as the Praetorian, Dorn was kept on quite a short leash? And if you're open to non-canon explorations, the Dornian heresy alternate timeline flips his loyalty, making him, rather than Horus, the leader of the traitors. All this stuff is really interesting for analysis. Please feel free to leave a comment about what you like and what you want to look into, and then go make your own video.